In the heart of Africa, there lay a vast and peaceful forest. Towering baobab trees stretched their branches toward the sky, their thick trunks holding up the world as it seemed. The forest was home to all sorts of animals: antelopes, zebras, parrots, and monkeys. At the edge of this forest flowed a mighty river, its water glistening under the sun's warm embrace. The river provided life to the animals, but it also held mysteries and dangers, for beneath its calm surface lurked creatures with sharp teeth and even sharper intentions. Among the trees, swinging from branch to branch, lived a clever monkey named Juma. Juma was known throughout the forest for his intelligence and quick thinking. He loved nothing more than spending his days leaping through the trees, chatting with the birds, and snacking on the sweet fruits that the forest generously offered. Life was good for Juma, and he was content. But little did he know, his peaceful days were about to change when he ventured closer to the riverbank. One afternoon, while Juma was gathering bananas near the river, he noticed something unusual. A large, scaly creature lay sunbathing on a rock near the water's edge. Curious, Juma swung down from the trees and cautiously approached. It was a crocodile, a creature Juma had heard many tales about but had never met in person. "Hello there," the crocodile called out in a surprisingly friendly voice. "I don't get many visitors here. My name is Kazi. What brings you so close to the river?" Juma, ever the friendly monkey, smiled and replied, "I was just gathering some bananas, and I noticed you resting by the water. I've never seen a crocodile up close before." Kazi smiled, though it wasn't the warmest of smiles. "Well, now you have. How about we become friends? I've been quite lonely lately, and it's always good to have a friend who can tell me about the world above the water." Juma, always looking for new companions, nodded. "I'd like that. I have many stories to share about the forest. Maybe one day you can tell me about life in the river." And so a friendship began. One that seemed harmless, but was rooted in something far more sinister. For the next few days, Juma and Kazi met regularly by the riverbank. They spent their time exchanging stories. Juma told Kazi about the tallest trees, the juiciest fruits, and the fastest animals that raced through the forest. Kazi in turn spoke of the deep river, the fish that swam in its waters, and the secrets hidden beneath its surface. Juma loved to tell stories, and Kazi seemed like a good listener. Always interested, always attentive. But what Juma didn't know was that Kazi's mind wasn't on the stories at all. The crocodile had his eyes set on something else: Juma himself. For days, Kazi had been plotting a way to... He knew that monkeys were tricky creatures, but Kazi believed he could outsmart him. After all, Kazi's family always said that clever prey made for the most satisfying meals. As Juma laughed and swung through the branches, Kazi's cold eyes followed him, masking the hunger beneath his calm exterior. Soon, Kazi thought to himself. Very soon. Late one night, after a long day of stories by the river, Kazi swam back to his family's lair, deep in the river's murky waters. His wife Kiva was waiting for him, eager to hear about his progress. She had grown tired of the fish and smaller animals that they usually ate, and she was eager for a bigger feast. "So how goes your little plan?" Kiva asked, her sharp teeth gleaming in the moonlight that filtered through the water. "Is the monkey getting close to trusting you?" Kazi nodded. "Oh yes. He thinks we're friends now. He has no idea what I'm planning. I'll soon convince him to climb on my back and take him across the river. And once we're far enough from the shore, well, I'll have a feast like no other." Kiva grinned. "Just be careful. Monkeys are known for their tricks. Don't underestimate him." "I won't," Kazi promised. But deep down, he believed he was smarter than any forest animal. He had his plan, and nothing would stop him from getting his prize. The next morning, Kazi greeted Juma with a wide smile. "Good morning, my friend," he called from the riverbank. "I've been thinking. You've told me so much about the forest, but you've never seen the wonders of the river. How about I take you for a ride across the water? There's a secret island with the sweetest fruit trees you've ever tasted. You won't find anything like it on this side of the river." Juma's eyes lit up with excitement. A new island? Sweet fruit? The offer was tempting, and Kazi seemed sincere. "Are you sure it's safe?" Juma asked, his natural caution making him hesitate. "Of course," Kazi said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "You can trust me, Juma. I'm your friend, aren't I? I wouldn't offer if it wasn't safe. Juma thought for a moment, then nodded. All right, I trust you, Kazi. Let's go. And with that, Juma hopped onto Kazi's back and the two began their journey across the river. But little did Juma know, he had just stepped into the first stage of Kazi's cunning plan. As Kazi glided through the water with Juma on his back, the river's cool breeze ruffled the monkey's fur. At first everything seemed perfect. The river was calm, and Kazi moved steadily toward the mysterious island he had promised. But as they ventured deeper into the river, Juma noticed something unsettling. Kazi was moving slower and deeper into the water. He began to buzz with caution. The farther they went, the more Kazi dipped under the water, and the more nervous Juma became. Kazi, why are we going so deep? Shouldn't we stay near the surface? Juma asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Kazi's cold eyes gleamed as he replied, Oh, don't worry about that. The river is simply deeper here. We'll get to the island soon enough. But Juma wasn't convinced. His clever mind worked quickly, sensing that something was off. Why was Kazi being so vague? Why had the river grown colder? As the water darkened, Juma decided it was time to test Kazi's true intentions. Tell me, Kazi, Juma began casually, masking his suspicion. How deep is this river exactly? It feels colder than I imagined. He watched Kazi's reaction carefully, waiting for a slip. Kazi chuckled, but it wasn't the same friendly laugh he'd used before. Oh, it's deep enough to hide anything, he replied, letting his voice drop slightly, especially the bones of any creature that gets too curious. Juma's heart raced, but he didn't let it show. So this was it, Kazi planned to eat him. The crocodile's true nature was revealed, and Juma knew he needed to think quickly. He looked around, scanning for anything that could help him. Ah, I see, Juma said, pretending to be unfazed. You know, Kazi, I think I forgot something very important back on the shore. Kazi raised a scaly brow. Oh, and what might that be? My heart, Juma said confidently. You see, we monkeys have a special trick. We don't carry our hearts inside us like other animals. I left mine hanging on the baobab tree. I'll need it if you want to eat me. Kazi stopped swimming, puzzled by Juma's words. You left your heart on the baobab tree? He repeated, trying to make sense of what the monkey was saying. Monkeys were strange creatures, clever and full of surprises, so it wasn't entirely impossible that Juma might be telling the truth. After all, Kazi had never eaten a monkey before. Maybe they really did keep their hearts outside their bodies. Yes, Juma nodded eagerly, sensing that Kazi was falling for his trick. It's no use eating me without my heart. I'd be just skin and bones. But don't worry, Kazi. If you take me back to the shore, I'll climb the tree and get it for you. Then you can have a proper feast. Kazi's eyes gleamed with greed. The thought of devouring Juma with his heart intact was too tempting to pass up. Without another word, Kazi turned around and started swimming back toward the shore, thinking he would soon enjoy the cleverest meal he had ever caught. Juma leaped from Kazi's back and scrambled up the nearest tree. He climbed higher and higher, laughing to himself as he realized how easily he had fooled the crocodile. Once Juma reached the top of the tree, he looked down at Kazi, who waited eagerly at the river's edge. The crocodile's sharp teeth gleamed in the sunlight as he licked his lips in anticipation. Well? Kazi called up. Where's your heart, monkey? Bring it down so I can finally enjoy my feast. Juma, safe in the treetops, burst into laughter. Oh, Kazi, you really believe that nonsense about me leaving my heart in the tree? You must be the most foolish crocodile in the whole river. Kazi's grin faded as the truth hit him. He had been tricked. His eyes narrowed, and he growled in frustration, his powerful tail slapping the water. But there was nothing he could do now. Juma was far out of reach, and Kazi had lost his chance. How dare you trick me? Kazi snarled. You'll regret this, Juma. But the clever monkey only laughed harder. Maybe so, but not today, my friend. Perhaps you should think twice before trying to eat someone who's smarter than you. With that, Juma swung from branch to branch, making his way deeper into the forest, leaving Kazi fuming by the riverbank. Word spread quickly through the forest of Juma's clever escape from the crocodile's jaws. The birds chirped the tale from tree to tree, and the smaller animals whispered it in the underbrush. Soon, every creature knew of the day when Juma had outsmarted Kazi. Many of the animals came to Juma, praising his quick thinking and asking how he had managed to fool such a dangerous predator. Juma smiled as he explained, "It's simple. You must always be wary of those who hide their true intentions behind a mask of friendship. Trust is something earned, not given freely." The animals nodded in agreement, for they too had encountered predators in disguise, and from that day on, they began to question the sincerity of those who approached them too eagerly. Juma's lesson had become a new rule of the forest. Trustworthiness was the most important quality in a friend. Meanwhile, Kazi sulked in the river, humiliated and angry. He had underestimated Juma, and now the whole forest knew of his failure. But Kazi wasn't done yet. No, he was far too proud to admit defeat. He would come up with another plan, a smarter one this time, and next time he would not be fooled so easily. Safety of the treetops, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. He knew Kazi wouldn't give up so easily. He would have to stay alert, for the battle of wits between the monkey and the crocodile had only just begun. Kazi spent days sulking in the river, his frustration growing with each passing moment. His pride had taken a blow, and he couldn't bear the thought of the entire forest laughing at him. Every time he swam past the shore, he would hear whispers from the birds perched in the trees, mocking him for falling for Juma's trick. His wife, Kiva, was no kinder. "How could you let a monkey fool you?" she asked with a sharp tone. "You, the great crocodile of the river, humiliated by a creature that swings from trees?" Kazi growled under his breath, too ashamed to respond. But deep inside, his anger turned into a burning desire for revenge. He had failed once, yes, but he was determined to regain his dignity. He vowed to himself that the next time he and Juma crossed paths, he would not only outsmart the monkey, but also make sure the forest animals feared him once again. He needed a new plan, a plan that would make Juma trust him again. And this time, Kazi swore he wouldn't fall for any of the monkey's tricks. A few days later, Kazi returned to the riverbank, this time with a new approach. He needed to convince Juma that he had changed, that he wasn't the cunning predator Juma had made him out to be. As the sun began to rise, casting golden light over the trees, Kazi spotted Juma sitting on a high branch, munching on a mango. "Good morning, Juma," Kazi called up, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine remorse. "I've come to apologize for what happened the other day." Juma looked down at Kazi, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Apologize? For trying to eat me?" Kazi nodded, putting on his most humble expression. "Yes, I realize now that I made a terrible mistake. I was driven by hunger and foolish pride. But I've learned my lesson, Juma. You are far too clever for me to trick, and I don't want to be enemies. Please, can we put the past behind us?" Juma, ever cautious, didn't immediately respond. He knew Kazi was crafty and that this sudden change of heart could be part of another plot. But Kazi seemed sincere, and if there was one thing Juma prided himself on, it was his ability to outwit anyone, no matter how dangerous. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to play along for now, Juma thought. After all, he had no intention of letting his guard down. "Very well," Juma replied, hopping down to a lower branch, still keeping a safe distance. "I accept your apology, but don't expect me to trust you just yet." Hiding the flicker of a smile. "Thank you, Juma. I promise you won't regret it." Over the next few days, Kazi worked hard to regain Juma's trust. He spent his time swimming lazily by the riverbank, making friendly conversation whenever Juma came near. He didn't ask Juma for anything, nor did he mention the failed plot from before. Instead, he played the role of a reformed friend, content with listening to Juma's stories about the forest. Then one morning, Kazi made a suggestion that piqued Juma's curiosity. "You know, Juma, I've been thinking. You've seen so much of the forest, but you still haven't explored the island I told you about." Juma's ears perked up. "The island with the sweet fruit trees?" Kazi nodded eagerly. "Yes, that's the one. I know what happened last time has made you cautious, but I swear on the spirit of the river that I have no ill intentions. I simply want to show you the wonders of the island. It's a place few animals have ever seen, and I think you'd love it." Juma frowned, his mind racing. Kazi had sworn by the spirit of the river, a sacred vow that no animal, not even a crocodile, would break lightly. And while Juma still didn't trust Kazi fully, the temptation of exploring the mysterious island was strong. "All right," Juma said after a long pause. I'll go with you, but I'll be watching closely, Kazi. Kazi grinned, his sharp teeth gleaming in the sunlight. Of course, my friend. I wouldn't have it any other way. This time Juma was more cautious. Before hopping onto Kazi's back, he made sure to study the river's surface. He took note of the nearby branches, rocks, and anything he could use if he needed to escape again. Once he was satisfied that he had a plan in place, Juma climbed onto Kazi's back, his eyes sharp and alert. Kazi, on the other hand, was unusually calm and polite. He swam smoothly, avoiding the deep waters that had raised Juma's suspicions before. As they moved through the river, Kazi spoke of peace and friendship, weaving a tale about how he had realized the error of his ways. I've lived for years by this river, and I've never had a true friend, Kazi said wistfully. But now that I've met you, Juma, I've come to see the value of companionship. I'm tired of tricks and deceit. All I want is peace. Juma listened carefully, but his mind was still cautious. He knew how easy it was for someone to lie with kind words. Still, Kazi seemed different this time. The crocodile's voice was softer, more genuine, and the journey had been uneventful so far. Perhaps, Juma thought, Kazi really had changed. But he wasn't about to let his guard down just yet. River, the water grew slightly deeper, though Kazi kept to the shallower areas. Juma relaxed, his grip on Kazi's back loosening just a little. He was starting to believe that maybe this time, Kazi was being sincere. The island was now visible in the distance, with tall trees heavy with fruit swaying gently in the breeze. But just as Juma began to feel at ease, something changed. Kazi's movements grew slower, his tail cutting through the water more cautiously. Juma tensed, his sharp instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. Before he could speak, Kazi suddenly dived underwater, his body sinking quickly into the depths, pulling Juma along with him. Juma gasped, holding onto Kazi's back as the cold water closed in around him. Kazi, what are you doing? Juma cried, panic rising in his chest. The crocodile had been so careful until now. Why the sudden change? But Kazi didn't answer. Instead, he held his breath as he plunged deeper into the water, gripping Juma tightly with his powerful jaws. The trickery had begun again. As Kazi pulled Juma deeper into the river, the cold water made it hard for the monkey to think. But Juma had been in dangerous situations before, and he knew that panicking would do him no good. His mind raced for a solution, and soon enough, a familiar idea struck him. Kazi, Juma gasped, struggling to keep his head above the water. If you wanted to eat me, you should have told me earlier. Kazi paused, curious despite his hunger. And why is that? Juma took a deep breath, trying to sound as calm as possible. Because, once again, I've left my heart behind, this time in the hollow of a tree near the riverbank. What good am I to you without it? Kazi slowed his descent, thinking hard. Juma had tricked him once before with this very lie, but the crocodile was now considering that maybe, just maybe, the clever monkey had been telling the truth all along. After all, no other animal had ever fooled him the way Juma had. Are you serious? Kazi asked, narrowing his eyes. Juma nodded furiously, trying to keep his desperation hidden. Of course! You can't enjoy a meal if it's missing the most important part, can you? Kazi hesitated. His instincts told him that this might be another trick, but the curiosity gnawed at him. What if monkeys really did keep their hearts outside their bodies? He didn't want to lose the chance at a perfect meal. Kazi began to swim toward the shore once again, giving Juma the chance he needed. As soon as Kazi reached the riverbank, Juma wasted no time. He jumped off the crocodile's back and scrambled up the nearest tree, his hands shaking from the close call. He climbed higher and higher, feeling the safety of the treetops surround him once again. From below, Kazi watched, his eyes narrowing with suspicion, as he waited for Juma to fetch his supposed heart. But Juma had no intention of coming back down. Instead, he perched on a high branch and looked down at Kazi with a grin. You know, Kazi, Juma called down, I can't believe you fell for that trick twice. You really are the most gullible crocodile in the entire river. Kazi's jaws clenched in fury, and his tail thrashed the water in frustration. He had been outwitted again, and this time, the humiliation stung even more. The entire forest would soon hear of his failure, again. Juma, feeling safe in his high perch, laughed and continued. Let this be a lesson to you, Kazi. You can't outsmart someone who's always thinking one step ahead. Perhaps next time you'll learn to be more honest instead of trying to trick others. Kazi growled under his breath, too angry to respond. Once again, Juma had escaped, but this time the crocodile was determined not to let the defeat break him. He would be back, and the next plan would be perfect. Kazi returned to the river's depths, furious and embarrassed. His wife, Kiva, greeted him with an amused expression, though she had already guessed the outcome from his sour mood. "Let me guess," Kiva said with a smirk. "The monkey fooled you again?" Kazi glared at her but didn't respond. He swam to a quiet corner of the river where he could sulk in peace. His frustration bubbled up like the river's currents, swirling around him in a cloud of resentment. How could I have fallen for the same trick twice? Kazi muttered to himself. That monkey is too clever for his own good. Kiva followed him, shaking her head. You should know by now that Juma is not an ordinary prey. Monkeys are tricky creatures. If you want to capture him, you'll have to stop relying on brute force and simple tricks. Use your mind, Kazi. For a moment, Kazi considered his wife's words. He had always relied on his strength and his natural predator instincts, but Juma had shown him that brute force wasn't enough. Kazi needed a plan that was more subtle, more intricate. If he could play a long game, perhaps he could catch Juma off guard. Said slowly, a new idea forming in his mind. I'll need to be more patient, and this time, I'll involve the other animals in the river. Together, we can set a trap that even the cleverest monkey won't see coming. Kazi spent the next few days quietly gathering allies among the river's creatures. The fish, the frogs, and even the birds that nested near the water's edge, all were eager to help Kazi capture Juma. Many of the animals had grown tired of hearing the stories of Juma's cleverness, and they saw this as a chance to humble the mischievous monkey. We'll lure him to the river with a feast of fruit, Kazi explained to the other animals. Once he's distracted, I'll make my move, but it must be done carefully. He cannot suspect anything. The animals agreed, and soon the plan was set in motion. Kazi had learned from his past mistakes and was determined not to let Juma outsmart him again. This time, the trap would be perfect. Meanwhile, Juma had grown more cautious. He had escaped Kazi twice, but he knew the crocodile wouldn't give up easily. Every time Juma approached the river, he kept a sharp eye on the water, watching for any signs of danger. He trusted no one, not even the smaller animals that gathered by the shore. But as the days passed, Juma's curiosity got the better of him. He noticed something strange. More and more animals were gathering near the riverbank, and they all seemed unusually friendly. As Kazi's plan moved forward, the spirit of the river, an ancient being that had watched over the waters for generations, began to stir. The river spirit had seen many battles between predator and prey, but it had also seen how deceit could lead to destruction. And now, it saw Kazi's growing obsession with capturing Juma. Late one evening, as Kazi rested in the shallow waters, the river spirit appeared before him in the form of a shimmering ripple across the surface. Its voice was deep and powerful, like the current of the river itself. Kazi, the spirit said, you have become blinded by your hunger for revenge. Be warned, if you continue down this path of trickery and deceit, you will face dire consequences. The river does not favor those who betray trust. Kazi frowned, unsure whether to be frightened or defiant. I am doing what any crocodile would do. It's in my nature to hunt. Why should I listen to you? Because there is more at stake than a simple meal, the spirit replied. Your actions will determine not only your fate but the balance of the river itself. Remember, trustworthiness and honor are as important as strength. Betray them, and you will pay a price greater than you can imagine. With that, the spirit vanished, leaving Kazi to ponder its words. But Kazi's hunger for revenge was strong, and despite the warning, he resolved to carry out his plan. Juma would not escape again, no matter the cost. The following morning, Juma was leaping between branches, enjoying the warm sunlight filtering through the trees, when he noticed something unusual by the riverbank. A large gathering of animals stood near the water's edge, fish jumping, birds fluttering, and even frogs hopping excitedly. Spread before them was a lavish feast of ripe fruit, bananas, mangoes, and berries glistening in the sun. Curious, Juma swung down to the lower branches, watching the scene unfold. The smell of the fruit was tempting, but the gathering seemed oddly timed. Why were so many animals gathered in one place, and who had arranged the feast? "Come join us, Juma," called a frog from the shore. "We've prepared a grand feast to celebrate the forest and river. You're the guest of honor." Juma's brow furrowed in suspicion. A feast just for him? His instincts buzzed with warning. He scanned the river, and though he couldn't see Kazi, he knew the crocodile must be lurking nearby. The animals seemed unusually eager for him to come down from the trees, and Juma could sense something wasn't right. But being the clever monkey he was, Juma decided to play along, for now. He would pretend to be interested, but he would keep a close watch for any sign of a trap. Juma cautiously swung down to a lower branch, just above the feast. He flashed a smile at the eager animals gathered below. "A feast for me! What a surprise! I'm honored, truly." He kept his voice light and friendly, but his eyes darted back and forth, analyzing every detail. The fish splashed excitedly in the water, and the frogs croaked in harmony. "Yes, yes. Join us, Juma. We've worked hard to prepare this for you." They croaked in unison, trying their best to seem genuine. Juma's sharp mind was racing. The more he observed, the more suspicious he grew. The animals were never this friendly, especially those from the river. The feast was clearly bait, but Juma needed to figure out exactly how they planned to trap him. He could sense the presence of Kazi nearby, even though the crocodile remained out of sight. Juma knew the best way to reveal a trick was to act as if he trusted them. "Very well," he said, pretending to relax. "But I'll need to wash my hands in the river first. After all, one should always clean up before a feast." The animals nodded eagerly, thinking Juma was falling into their trap. But Juma had no intention of going near the water. He was testing their reaction. Juma leapt gracefully to the ground and walked slowly toward the water, pretending to inspect the feast along the way. He made a great show of licking his lips, as though the fruit were irresistible. But his eyes were sharp, scanning every detail for clues. As he approached the water's edge, Juma saw it, a slight ripple in the surface, moving unnaturally close to the shore. Kazi was hiding just beneath the water, waiting for Juma to come closer so he could pounce. Juma stopped short, pretending to admire the reflection of the sun on the river. Such clear water today," he said aloud, hoping to provoke a response. Nothing. The ripple remained still, but Juma knew Kazi was there, holding his breath and waiting. The other animals grew tense, their eyes fixed on Juma. They were clearly waiting for something to happen. Juma smiled to himself. He had confirmed his suspicions. This was the trap. But how could he outsmart Kazi and his accomplices this time? With a mischievous grin, Juma bent down, pretending to dip his hands in the water. But at the last second, he sprang backward, flipping into the nearest branch with a burst of laughter. "Nice try, Kazi, but you'll have to do better than that," Juma called out, swinging from branch to branch. Below, the ripple in the water exploded as Kazi surged out, his jaws snapping at the air where Juma had just stood. "Curses!" Kazi roared, furious that his trap had failed once again. The other animals scattered in fear, knowing they had been part of the failed scheme. Kazi was livid. For days he had carefully orchestrated this plan, convincing the other animals to help lure Juma into his grasp. He had counted on their collective efforts to distract the clever monkey. But once again, Juma's quick thinking had thwarted him. As the river's waters calmed and the feast lay abandoned, Kazi sulked beneath the surface, his rage bubbling up like the currents. He couldn't understand how Juma had seen through the plan so easily. How could a simple monkey outwit him time and time again? Kiva, who had been watching from the deeper waters, swam over to her husband. "You're letting your hunger for revenge cloud your judgment, Kazi. You need a new strategy." Kazi growled under his breath. "I've tried tricks, I've tried traps, I've tried everything. But that monkey is too clever. No matter what I do, he slips away." "Perhaps," Kiva suggested carefully, "you need to change your approach. Stop trying to trap him outright. If you keep pushing, he'll only grow more suspicious. Let him think he's won, lure him in with patience." Kazi mulled over her words, his anger simmering down. Maybe Kiva was right. Maybe he needed to slow down and let Juma's guard drop. This battle wasn't just about strength anymore. It was a test of patience and cunning. As Juma swung through the trees, putting more distance between himself and the river, He couldn't help but reflect on the events of the day. Kazi had grown more desperate, and the traps were becoming more elaborate. The crocodile had even enlisted other animals in his schemes. But through it all, Juma's quick thinking had saved him. Still, Juma knew this game of survival wasn't over. He had outwitted Kazi again, but he could feel that something was changing. Kazi's determination to catch him was growing stronger with each failure. Juma would have to be more cautious than ever before, and he couldn't let his guard down even for a moment. As he settled on a high branch, looking out over the forest, Juma realized something important. This battle wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about wisdom. The more he faced Kazi's tricks, the more he learned about the importance of staying alert and relying on his instincts. But there was something else, too, a nagging thought in the back of his mind. Juma began to wonder if Kazi would ever truly give up, or if the crocodile's hunger for revenge would eventually lead to his own downfall. For now, Juma would stay one step ahead, but he knew the time would come when Kazi would try again. And when that day came, Juma would be ready. After narrowly escaping Kazi's trap at the river feast, Juma decided it was best to keep his distance from the river for a while. He stayed high in the trees, enjoying the fruits of the forest and the company of the birds, but always keeping a watchful eye on the horizon. The animals of the forest began to notice Juma's cautious behavior and grew curious. "You're always looking over your shoulder," one parrot remarked as Juma swung by. "Do you think Kazi is still after you?" Juma smiled, though his eyes remained sharp. "I know Kazi won't give up that easily. He's out there, waiting, but I won't be caught off guard." Days passed, and though the river remained quiet, Juma couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. He knew Kazi too well. The crocodile wouldn't stay silent for long, and Juma had no intention of being lulled into a false sense of security. Meanwhile, deep beneath the river, Kazi had taken his wife Kiva's advice to heart. He was done with rash attempts and obvious traps. This time, he would wait. Juma had grown suspicious of the river and the animals near it, so Kazi needed to play a longer game. Instead of hunting openly, Kazi focused on building alliances quietly. He spread the word among the river animals that patience was key. "Let Juma think we've given up," Kazi instructed the fish, the frogs, and the birds who lived near the water. "When the time is right, we'll strike, but until then, act normal. Let him feel safe." The river animals obeyed, knowing that Kazi's plan, though slow, would eventually lead to Juma's downfall. They began to behave as if everything was back to normal. No more feasts, no more strange gatherings by the shore. To anyone watching, it seemed as though the river had returned to its usual calm. But beneath that calm, Kazi watched and waited, his hunger for revenge growing stronger with each passing day. Weeks passed, and Juma began to notice the quiet. No more strange invitations, no more suspicious behavior from the river creatures. The birds and frogs by the riverbank seemed to have forgotten about Kazi's plots, and everything appeared to be back to normal. Juma, always alert, remained cautious, but couldn't help but feel a little more at ease. Maybe, just maybe, Kazi had finally given up. Perhaps the crocodile had realized that no matter how many plans he made, Juma would always be one step ahead. One afternoon, while resting high in a baobab tree, Juma noticed a flock of birds flying lazily near the river. They were chirping and singing, their carefree behavior convincing him that there was no danger nearby. "Maybe Kazi's learned his lesson," Juma said to himself, relaxing against the tree trunk. "He hasn't tried anything in weeks." But deep down, Juma knew better than to completely trust the silence. The quiet before the storm was often the most dangerous. The next morning, as Juma was gathering fruits, he heard a familiar voice calling from below. It was one of the river birds perched on a low branch near the water's edge. "Juma, we haven't seen you near the river in so long," the bird called cheerfully. "It's peaceful again, you know. No more tricks or traps. Kazi has moved on." Juma paused, holding a ripe mango in his hand. "Are you sure about that?" he asked cautiously. "Kazi's not exactly the type to give up so easily." The bird tilted its head. "Oh, but he has. The river has been calm for weeks. Come down, Juma. Come enjoy the river's cool breeze and the sweet fruits that grow by the shore. We miss your company." Juma hesitated. The bird seemed genuine, and it was true that Kazi hadn't been seen in a long while. Maybe the crocodile really had given up. Maybe it was safe to go near the river again. But then Juma remembered his past experiences. The traps, the tricks, the narrow escapes. "I think I'll stay in the trees for now," he said with a smile, swinging up to a higher branch. "I've grown to like the view from up here." The bird fluttered its wings and flew back toward the river, its cheerful demeanor fading as soon as it disappeared from sight. It had delivered the message as Kazi had asked, but Juma was still too clever to take the bait. That evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Juma gathered a few of the forest animals for a meeting. He sensed that the calm by the river was deceptive, and he wanted to make sure the other creatures stayed alert. "We all know Kazi," Juma began, his voice firm. "He doesn't give up easily, and this long silence from the river worries me. I think he's planning something bigger than before." The animals, who had grown used to the quiet days, murmured among themselves. Some believed Juma, while others were less concerned. "But the river has been peaceful for weeks," a young antelope said. "Why would Kazi wait so long to strike?" Juma shook his head. "That's exactly what worries me. He's waiting because he knows that patience is the only way he can catch me off guard. Don't trust the calm, stay alert, and be careful if you go near the river." The animals nodded, some more convinced than others, but all agreed to keep their distance from the water for the time being. Juma had saved himself and others from Kazi's tricks before, and they knew it was better to be safe than sorry. As the meeting ended, Juma remained perched on a high branch, watching the stars begin to twinkle above. He could feel it in his bones. Kazi wasn't done. The crocodile was out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Kazi swam through the river's depths, invisible to the forest above. His patience, though strained by hunger and frustration, was growing stronger. He had learned from his past failures. Each trap had been too rushed, too obvious. This time, he would wait for the perfect moment to strike. The river creatures, aware of Kazi's plan, stayed quiet as well. The fish swam close to the surface, but avoided the riverbank. The birds still perched near the water's edge, but kept their distance from the forest animals. Everyone knew their roles, and they played them well. "Kazi has learned patience," one frog whispered to another as they watched from the reeds. "He will strike when the monkey least expects it." And Kazi knew that his time would come. He just had to let the forest animals believe they were safe for a little longer. Then, when their guard was down, Juma would fall into his jaws, and the clever monkey would finally be his. One day, as Juma was swinging through the trees, he noticed something unusual below. A stranger was moving through the forest. A small, unfamiliar animal with sleek fur and a long, bushy tail. Juma had never seen this creature before, and his curiosity was immediately piqued. The stranger walked slowly, as if lost or confused, glancing around at the trees with wide eyes. Intrigued, Juma leapt down from the branches and landed softly in front of the new animal. "Hello there," Juma greeted, his usual friendly smile on his face. "I don't think I've seen you in the forest before. What brings you here?" The stranger blinked, startled by Juma's sudden appearance. "Oh, I'm just passing through," the animal replied nervously. "I'm looking for a place to rest. The river seems peaceful. Do you know if it's safe?" Juma's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about the stranger's question felt odd. He had just warned the forest animals to avoid the river, and yet here was this newcomer, asking about its safety. Juma's instincts flared, and he felt a twinge of suspicion. "It depends," Juma said carefully. "The river has been quiet lately, but that doesn't always mean it's safe." The stranger nodded quickly. "I see. Well, thank you. I think I'll continue on my way." With that, the animal turned and scurried toward the river, disappearing into the underbrush. Juma watched the stranger go, his mind buzzing with questions. Who was that? And why was he asking about the river? As Juma returned to the treetops, he couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger's appearance wasn't a coincidence. Something about the way the animal had asked about the river didn't sit right with him. Juma knew the forest and its creatures well, and newcomers were rare. If someone was coming near the river now, it had to mean something. That night, as Juma lay on a high branch looking up at the stars, he replayed the conversation in his mind. What if the stranger was part of Kazi's plan? Could Kazi have sent this animal to test him, to see if Juma would relax his guard. The more Juma thought about it, the more certain he became. Kazi's patience was growing, and this newcomer was likely just another part of the crocodile's game. Juma needed to be more careful than ever. As the wind rustled through the trees, Juma made a silent vow to himself. He wouldn't let his guard down. No matter what Kazi tried, Juma would stay one step ahead. He just had to keep trusting his instincts. The next few days brought a change in the weather. Dark clouds began to gather in the sky, casting shadows over the forest and the river. The air grew thick with humidity, and the animals of the forest moved more slowly, sensing that a storm was on its way. Juma, ever watchful, noticed that the river creatures were behaving differently as well. The birds that usually sang near the water's edge were quieter, and the fish were no longer leaping joyfully in the river. It was as if they, too, were waiting for something to happen. As the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain, Juma climbed to the top of the tallest tree in the forest to get a better view. From there, he could see the river stretching out before him, the dark clouds rolling in from the horizon. But something else caught his eye: movement in the water. At first, Juma thought it was just the current shifting with the wind, but then he saw it again, a shadow moving just beneath the surface. Kazi, the crocodile, was lurking, as Juma had suspected, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The stormy weather would provide cover, and Kazi would use it to his advantage. Juma's mind raced. He had to be ready. He couldn't let the storm distract him, nor could he allow Kazi to catch him by surprise. The storm wasn't just in the sky, it was coming for him. As the storm drew nearer, the forest grew eerily quiet. The animals sensed the tension in the air, and even the birds stopped singing. Juma, high in his tree, kept a close watch on the river, knowing that Kazi was down there, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Kazi wasn't the only one waiting. Juma, too, was prepared. He had been watching Kazi's movements for days, and he knew that the crocodile would make his move soon. The storm would be the perfect cover for Kazi's attack, but Juma wouldn't be caught off guard this time. That night, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Juma stayed wide awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind howled through the trees, and the river's current grew stronger, but Juma's sharp ears picked up on something else. A faint splash, followed by the soft slither of scales against the water's edge. Kazi was coming. Juma gripped the branch tightly, his heart racing. The storm had arrived, and so had the next phase of their deadly game. But Juma wasn't afraid. He was ready. As the rain poured down in sheets, drenching the forest, Juma stayed perched high in the treetops, alert to every sound. The storm was now in full force, with lightning streaking across the sky and thunder rumbling deep within the clouds. Juma knew that this was the moment Kazi had been waiting for, using the storm as a cover to mask his movements and give him the advantage. Sure enough, as Juma scanned the river below, he saw a flash of movement in the water. Kazi's dark shape moving silently through the churning current. The crocodile was careful this time, not making the same mistakes as before. He was slower, more methodical, inching closer to the riverbank without drawing attention. But Juma was ready. His sharp eyes tracked Kazi's every move, watching as the crocodile crept closer to a large rock near the water's edge. Kazi was setting up his strike, waiting for Juma to make one careless move that would bring him into reach of those powerful jaws. Juma swung lower, positioning himself just above the riverbank, where the wind made the branches sway dangerously. He had a plan, a bold one, but it required perfect timing. He waited, heart pounding, as Kazi slowly approached, his eyes gleaming through the rain. As Kazi reached the base of the rock, he positioned himself perfectly, ready to launch his attack. The storm raged around him, the river surging wildly, but Kazi's focus was singular, on Juma. The crocodile watched the monkeys swing precariously from the branches above, the wind making each movement unpredictable. Now was the time. With a burst of speed, Kazi launched himself out of the water, jaws wide open, aiming directly for Juma's position. His powerful tail propelled him forward with terrifying force, and for a moment, it seemed as though Juma had no chance of escape. But just as Kazi's jaws snapped shut, Juma swung higher, narrowly missing the crocodile's teeth. Kazi's jaws closed with a loud crack, biting down on nothing but air. His massive body crashed against the rock, splashing water everywhere, and Juma swung to safety, his heart racing. "Nice try, Kazi," Juma called out from the higher branch, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "But you'll need to be faster than that to catch me," Kazi snarled, furious that his carefully planned attack had failed. He thrashed in the water, but the storm made it difficult for him to regain control. Juma, still high in the trees, knew he had only bought himself a little time. The storm was in Kazi's favor, and if Juma made one wrong move, the crocodile would get another chance. Kazi was seething with anger as he pulled himself back into the water. His jaws ached from the force of the mist bite, and the storm's violent winds only made his frustration grow. This had been his best chance yet, and he had come so close. Yet Juma had slipped away again, just like before. But Kazi wasn't about to give up. The storm was still raging, and he knew Juma couldn't stay in the trees forever. The wind would tire him, and eventually he would have to make a move. Kazi's patience had grown stronger with each failure, and he was determined not to let this one defeat break him. "Stay up there as long as you like, monkey," Kazi muttered under his breath. "But when you come down, I'll be waiting." The crocodile sank beneath the water once more, disappearing into the shadows. He would wait as long as it took for Juma to make a mistake. This time, there would be no escape. Juma watched the river carefully, his mind racing as he considered his next move. Kazi was no longer visible, but Juma knew the crocodile was still lurking beneath the surface, waiting for him to come down. The storm made it difficult to see, and the howling wind made every branch sway dangerously. Staying in the treetops was no longer safe. But Juma wasn't about to give Kazi the upper hand. He knew that if he simply tried to outrun the crocodile, Kazi's speed and strength in the water would give him the advantage. Juma needed a new plan, one that would take Kazi by surprise and put him back on the defensive. As the rain continued to pour, Juma noticed something in the distance. A series of large boulders scattered along the riverbank, partially hidden by the rising water. If he could reach those rocks, he might be able to use them to his advantage. Swinging to a lower branch, Juma calculated the distance between his current position and the nearest rock. The storm had made the river swell, but the rocks were still visible, offering a potential escape route. He just had to move quickly and time his leap perfectly. Without hesitation, Juma took a deep breath and swung into the air, aiming for the first boulder. Juma's heart raced as he soared through the air, the wind whipping around him. He reached out, fingers stretching toward the slick surface of the boulder as the river's angry waters churned below. For a split second, it seemed as though the storm might carry him away, but Juma's agility didn't fail him. He landed on the rock with a thud, his hands gripping its rough surface. The rain poured down, making the rocks slippery and treacherous, but Juma moved with speed and precision. He leapt from one boulder to the next, each jump more daring than the last, all while keeping a watchful eye on the river. Kazi, sensing movement, shot out from beneath the water just as Juma landed on the third rock. The crocodile's massive jaws snapped shut inches from Juma's tail, but the monkey was too fast. He darted to the next boulder, staying just ahead of Kazi's attacks. For a moment, it looked like Kazi might catch him. The crocodile's powerful body surged through the water, closing the distance between them. But Juma had one final leap to make. With all the strength he had left, he jumped toward the safety of a high branch, catching it just as Kazi's jaws slammed shut on the last rock, missing him by a hair's breadth. Breathing heavily but triumphant, Juma swung to the highest point of the tree, looking down at the river. "You almost had me, Kazi," Juma called, his voice carrying through the storm. "But not today." Kazi roared in frustration, his eyes burning with rage. He had come so close, but once again, Juma had outsmarted him. And now, as the storm began to subside, Kazi knew he would have to return to the drawing board. But this wasn't the end. Kazi had tasted near victory, and he wouldn't stop until Juma was finally his. As the storm began to fade and the rain slowed to a drizzle, the forest slowly came back to life. Birds began to chirp again, and small animals crept cautiously from their hiding places, shaking off the last drops of rain. But the river remained swollen, its waters rushing and carrying debris from the storm's wrath. Juma, still perched high in the tree, watched the river carefully. The storm had passed, But he knew that Kazi's determination hadn't. The crocodile had come too close this time, and Juma's narrow escape had likely only fueled Kazi's hunger for revenge. Kazi, meanwhile, sulked in the murky depths of the river, licking his wounds from the failed attempt. He had thought the storm would give him the perfect cover, but once again, Juma had outsmarted him. The crocodile's pride was deeply wounded, and the animals of the river dared not approach him as he stewed in silence. But Kazi wasn't done. He would never be done until he had the clever monkey in his grasp. And now, the crocodile was more determined than ever to put an end to this game once and for all. As Juma swung from tree to tree, putting more distance between himself and the river, he reflected on his close encounter with Kazi. This time, the crocodile had nearly succeeded, and Juma knew that Kazi would keep trying. The storm had given Kazi an advantage, but it had also taught Juma something important. Kazi's patience wasn't endless. For all of Kazi's cunning, the crocodile was growing desperate. Each failed attempt had only made him more reckless, more eager to capture Juma at any cost. And desperate predators were the most dangerous of all. Juma knew that he had to remain vigilant, but he also realized that he could use Kazi's desperation to his advantage. The more Kazi relied on brute force, the more mistakes he would make. Juma just had to stay one step ahead and turn Kazi's impatience against him. With a new sense of clarity, Juma made his way deeper into the forest, carefully planning his next move. He wouldn't just defend himself from Kazi's tricks anymore. He would start setting traps of his own. Deep beneath the water, Kazi seethed with rage. His failed attack during the storm had been his best chance yet, and the fact that Juma had escaped again was driving him mad. The other river creatures avoided him, knowing that any attempt to approach the furious crocodile would result in his snapping jaws. Tiva, watching from a distance, could see that her husband's obsession with catching Juma was consuming him. "You need to calm down, Kazi," she warned one evening as he paced the riverbank. "Your anger is clouding your judgment. If you keep rushing into these attacks, the monkey will continue to outsmart you." But Kazi refused to listen. "I don't need calm. I need that monkey. I've waited long enough, and every time I come close, he slips through my jaws. I will not rest until I've captured him." Tiva sighed, knowing that there was no reasoning with Kazi when he was like this. But she also knew that if Kazi wasn't careful, his obsession would be his downfall. Juma was clever, yes, but Kazi's impatience was becoming his greatest weakness. Kazi, however, refused to acknowledge this. His fury burned too hot, and he was determined to make Juma pay for every time he had escaped, no matter what it took. As the days passed, Juma's mind worked tirelessly to come up with a plan to outsmart Kazi once and for all. He knew that the next time Kazi struck, it would be with even more force and determination, and Juma needed to be ready. He had to lure Kazi into a trap, one that the crocodile wouldn't see coming. After scouting the forest, Juma found the perfect spot. A narrow part of the river where the water flowed quickly and large rocks jutted out from the surface. It was a dangerous area for anyone to cross, even for a crocodile as strong as Kazi. But Juma had an idea. He would use the river's current to his advantage. Juma began gathering vines and large branches from the forest, working quietly and efficiently. He built a simple but clever trap, a series of ropes that would catch Kazi and pull him into the fast-moving current if the crocodile tried to attack. The plan was risky, but Juma had confidence in his ability to outthink Kazi. Once the trap was set, Juma waited, hiding in the trees and watching the river carefully. He knew it was only a matter of time before Kazi made his move. Juma's trap was ready, and now all he needed was the perfect bait to lure Kazi into it. He thought carefully about how to draw the crocodile in without arousing suspicion. Juma knew that Kazi was angry, impatient, and hungry for revenge, traits that could be used against him. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the forest, Juma climbed down from his hiding place and moved closer to the river. He made sure to make noise, shaking branches and rustling leaves as he approached the water's edge. He wanted Kazi to know he was there. "Such a peaceful evening," Juma said loudly, pretending to talk to himself. "I think I'll relax by the river for a while. Maybe I'll even gather some fruit from the nearby trees." Juma knew that Kazi would hear him, and he knew the crocodile wouldn't be able to resist such an opportunity. Sure enough, Juma saw the faintest ripple in the water, a sign that Kazi was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Juma pretended to be unaware of the danger, walking slowly along the riverbank and acting as though he was distracted by the fruit trees. But all the while his sharp eyes were fixed on the water, ready to spring his trap. The bait was set. Now, all Juma had to do was wait for Kazi to take it. Juma crouched low on a branch overlooking the river, his eyes focused on the water's surface. The faint ripple he had noticed earlier had disappeared, but he knew Kazi was still there, hidden beneath the murky depths. The crocodile wouldn't pass up such an opportunity. The evening was quiet, except for the soft rush of the river. The forest creatures had all retreated for the night, leaving the air thick with anticipation. Juma's trap was ready, and now all he had to do was wait for Kazi to take the bait. "Come on, Kazi," Juma muttered to himself, his heart pounding. "I know you're there." Suddenly, he saw it, a faint ripple just under the surface, moving steadily toward him. Kazi was making his move, slowly and cautiously, thinking he could catch Juma off guard. But Juma wasn't fooled. Every movement had been carefully planned. As Kazi inched closer, Juma braced himself. He couldn't let the crocodile see the trap, not until it was too late. This time, the game would end differently. Beneath the water, Kazi's dark eyes gleamed with focus. He had waited long enough. Juma had let his guard down, or so it seemed, and Kazi was determined not to waste this chance. The monkey was near the river's edge, seemingly unaware of the danger lurking just below. Kazi swam silently, his powerful tail propelling him forward through the current. He had learned from his past failures. There would be no rushing in this time, no wild leaps or sudden strikes. This attack would be precise. The crocodile's mind raced as he approached. He pictured the moment his jaws would finally snap shut around Juma, the satisfying victory he had longed for after all this time. No more tricks, no more escapes. The clever monkey's luck had run out. Kazi edged closer, now only feet away from where Juma stood near the riverbank. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. With a silent breath, Kazi prepared to lunge. Just as Kazi was about to strike, Juma made his move. With a swift leap, the monkey swung from a low-hanging branch and landed on a boulder in the middle of the river, right where his trap had been set. Kazi, seeing his prey escape again, roared in fury and lunged forward, his jaws snapping in frustration. But in his haste, he didn't notice the vine Juma had tied to the rocks beneath the water's surface. The trap was sprung. As Kazi surged toward the boulder, his body slammed into the hidden vines, pulling them taut. Instantly, the trap sprang into action. The vines wrapped around Kazi's massive frame, tightening with the force of the river's current. Kazi thrashed in the water, trying to free himself, but the more he struggled, the tighter the vines became. Juma watched from the safety of the boulder, his heart racing with triumph. The trap had worked perfectly. Kazi was caught, bound by the very river he had used to hunt Juma. "Looks like you've finally been outsmarted, Kazi," Juma called out, his voice carrying over the sound of the rushing water. "You may be strong, but you're no match for a clever mind." Kazi roared in frustration, thrashing wildly in the water, but it was no use. The current was too strong, and the vines held him fast. Bound by the vines and trapped by the river's powerful current, Kazi's rage grew with each passing second. He thrashed and snapped his jaws, desperately trying to free himself, but the more he struggled, the more the river's current pulled him deeper into the trap. The crocodile's powerful tail slapped the water, sending waves crashing against the rocks, but no matter how hard Kazi fought, he couldn't break free. Juma's trap was too well designed. The more Kazi resisted, the tighter the vines became, pulling him further into the river's depths. For the first time, Kazi felt a surge of fear. He had always been the predator, the one in control, but now he was helpless, caught by his own impatience and rage. His hunger for revenge had clouded his judgment, and now he was paying the price. "Juma," Kazi bellowed, his voice filled with desperation. "You can't leave me here. Help me, and I'll spare you." Juma, still perched on the boulder, looked down at the struggling crocodile. For a moment he considered Kazi's words. The thought of leaving Kazi trapped forever in the river was tempting, but Juma wasn't cruel. He had never wanted to hurt Kazi, only to teach him a lesson. "Spare me?" Juma called back, his tone thoughtful. Why should I believe you, Kazi? You've tried to trick me too many times. Kazi thrashed again, the vines pulling him deeper. Because I've learned my lesson. I'll leave you in peace if you help me out of this. Juma stood still for a moment, watching Kazi struggle in the river. He knew the crocodile was dangerous, but he also knew that everyone, even the most fearsome predator, could learn from their mistakes. Juma had always believed that trust and cleverness could overcome even the most difficult challenges, and now he had the chance to test that belief. "All right, Kazi," Juma said at last, his voice steady. "I'll help you out of this, but only if you promise no more tricks, no more trying to eat me or any other animal in this forest." Kazi, still bound by the vines, hesitated. His pride fought against the idea of giving up, but he had no other choice. If he didn't agree, the river would eventually pull him under, and his strength wouldn't be enough to save him. He had been outsmarted, and there was no escaping that truth. I promise," Kazi muttered, his voice low and defeated. "No more tricks, no more trying to eat you. Just get me out of here." Juma nodded, satisfied with Kazi's answer. Carefully, he untied the end of the vine from the rocks, loosening the trap and allowing the river to carry Kazi out of the current and back to calmer waters. Kazi, finally free from the trap, swam to the riverbank and pulled himself onto the shore, his body aching from the struggle. He looked up at Juma, who remained perched on the boulder, and for the first time, Kazi felt a grudging respect for the clever monkey. "You've won this time, Juma," Kazi admitted, his voice quiet. "But I won't forget this." Juma smiled, knowing that the lesson had been learned. "I don't expect you to forget, Kazi. Just remember, strength and cleverness aren't everything. Trust and wisdom are what truly matter." With that, Juma swung back into the trees, leaving Kazi on the riverbank to reflect on the battle they had fought. The news of Kazi's defeat spread quickly through the forest. Birds chirped the tale from tree to tree, and the smaller animals whispered in awe about Juma's cleverness. Even the larger animals, who usually paid little attention to the happenings near the river, began to admire Juma's wisdom. For Juma, it was a quiet victory. He had outsmarted Kazi, but more importantly, he had taught the crocodile a valuable lesson. Juma believed that this was the end of their dangerous game, and he hoped that peace would finally settle over the forest. But the forest itself seemed to whisper warnings. The wind rustled through the trees with an uneasy tone, and the river's waters, though calmer now, still carried a sense of unease. The animals continued to talk about Juma's triumph, but some wondered whether Kazi's promise could truly be trusted. Juma, ever alert, knew that he couldn't completely let down his guard. A predator's nature is hard to change, and though Kazi had made a promise, Juma couldn't be certain that the crocodile wouldn't try something again. Kazi lay on the riverbank, his body aching from the struggle against Juma's trap. His pride was shattered, and though he had given his word not to harm Juma or the other animals, his mind was still in turmoil. How could a mere monkey, swinging from trees, have outsmarted him so easily? For days, Kazi stayed away from the other creatures of the river, too humiliated to show his face. His wife, Tiva, approached him cautiously one evening, her eyes filled with concern. "You've been quiet since your defeat," Tiva said softly, sitting by his side. "I know it must be difficult for you to accept, but perhaps this is for the best. Juma taught you a lesson that even the strongest of us must learn. There are battles that cannot be won through force alone." Kazi didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were tangled between resentment and self-reflection. Was it possible that he had been wrong all along? Could wisdom and cleverness truly outweigh brute strength? He had given Juma his word, and he couldn't deny the grudging respect he now felt for the monkey. But even so, Kazi's pride still burned. He wasn't ready to let go of his desire for revenge, but he knew that any further attempt to capture Juma would require more than brute strength. "I'll honor my promise," Kazi finally muttered. "But that doesn't mean I've forgotten." As days passed, Juma began to notice that the forest was slowly returning to its normal rhythm. The birds sang their morning songs once more, and the animals roamed freely again, no longer whispering about Kazi's failed attempts to catch the clever monkey. Juma felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the forest animals could live in peace again, free from the fear of Kazi's trickery. Yet, even with the quiet settling over the trees, Juma remained cautious. He couldn't ignore the possibility that Kazi might one day go back on his word. One morning, as Juma gathered fruit from the trees, an old tortoise approached him, moving slowly but steadily through the underbrush. The tortoise was wise, known throughout the forest for his deep knowledge of the world. "I hear you have outsmarted Kazi, young Juma," the tortoise said, his voice low and thoughtful. "But beware, a wounded predator is the most dangerous kind. Kazi may honor his promise now, but old grudges can be hard to bury." Juma nodded thoughtfully, appreciating the tortoise's wisdom. "I haven't forgotten who Kazi is," Juma replied. "I'll stay watchful, just in case. But for now, I believe he's learned something from this. I hope it will last." The tortoise smiled faintly. "Only time will tell, my friend, but trust your instincts, as you always have." Though Kazi had promised to leave Juma and the other animals in peace, the balance of the forest had been disturbed by their conflict. The tension between the river and the forest had grown deeper, and other creatures had started to take notice. In the far reaches of the forest, a sly jackal named Zuri had been watching the unfolding events with great interest. Zuri was known for her cunning and ambition, always seeking ways to climb to the top of the animal hierarchy. She had heard of Juma's cleverness and Kazi's defeat, and it intrigued her. "If a mere monkey can outwit the mighty crocodile, then perhaps I too could rise to greater power," Zuri thought, her sharp eyes gleaming as she moved through the shadows of the forest. Unlike Kazi, Zuri didn't rely on brute strength. She prided herself on her trickery, her ability to manipulate situations to her advantage. And now, she saw an opportunity. Perhaps Juma could be an ally or a new rival. Zuri began plotting her own game, one that would challenge both Juma's cleverness and Kazi's promise of peace. The forest wasn't as calm as it seemed, and Zuri intended to stir things up once more. Zuri moved swiftly through the forest, her mind racing with possibilities. She had seen the way Juma had outwitted Kazi, and she respected his intelligence. But she also knew that in the world of the wild, cleverness wasn't enough. A true leader must also be ruthless. Her plan was simple. She would test Juma. If he could be manipulated, she would use him to her advantage. If he couldn't, she would expose his weaknesses and rise to take his place as the cleverest creature in the forest. Zuri started by spreading rumors among the smaller animals. Whispers that Juma had grown arrogant after his victory over Kazi, that he no longer cared for the well-being of the other creatures. The rumors spread quickly, and soon, the forest animals began to grow uneasy. Meanwhile, Zuri approached Kazi in secret. She knew the crocodile still harbored resentment, despite his promise. "You may have been outwitted by Juma," she said slyly, "but that doesn't mean you've lost. If you were to, say, align with me, we could bring down the monkey together." Kazi, though cautious, listened to her words. He had sworn not to harm Juma, but Zuri's offer was tempting. He wouldn't break his promise, but if someone else were to challenge Juma, wouldn't that be a different story? The seeds of doubt and deception were planted. Zuri's plan was in motion, and soon, Juma would face a new kind of challenge, one that would test not only his cleverness, but his ability to navigate the forest's changing loyalties. The forest, once filled with songs and laughter, began to change. The animals whispered among themselves, casting nervous glances at Juma whenever he passed by. Zuri's rumors were working. Slowly but surely, the confidence the animals had once placed in Juma's wisdom was starting to falter. It didn't take long for Juma to notice the shift. The once friendly chatter of the birds now quieted when he swung by. The smaller animals, who had once sought his guidance, now avoided his gaze. Juma's instincts told him something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on what had caused this sudden change. One morning, as Juma rested high in a tree, a young hare cautiously approached him, looking nervous. "Juma," the hare said quietly, "there's something going around. Rumors. They say you've become too proud, that you don't care about the forest anymore." Juma frowned, surprised by the words. "Who says these things?" The hare hesitated, then whispered, "I don't know for sure, but I've heard it from some of the smaller animals. They think you've forgotten about us now that you've defeated Kazi." Juma's mind raced. He had always been careful to protect and guide the forest animals. Where were these rumors coming from? He knew he had to get to the bottom of this before the entire forest turned against him. As Juma pondered the strange rumors, Zuri the jackal watched him from the shadows. She had been careful to avoid confronting Juma directly, instead letting her whispers work their way through the forest like a creeping vine. Her plan was unfolding perfectly. Zuri knew that to challenge Juma outright would be too risky. The monkey was clever, and his reputation still carried weight, even with the rumors spreading. But if she could isolate him, make him doubt his place in the forest, then he would become vulnerable. One afternoon, as Juma swung through the trees, Zuri followed from a distance, her sharp eyes observing every movement. She had learned from Kazi's failures. Juma couldn't be outsmarted by force alone, but Zuri was different. She thrived on manipulation and deceit, and soon enough, she would make her move. As she watched Juma pause to rest on a branch, Zuri smirked to herself. The monkey wouldn't see her coming, not until it was too late. Determined to find out who was behind the rumors, Juma began asking the forest animals about what they had heard. But most of the creatures were too nervous to speak openly, afraid of getting involved in whatever tension was building. Frustrated but persistent, Juma decided to take a more direct approach. He visited the older, wiser animals of the forest, the ones who had seen many seasons pass and knew the ways of the wild. One afternoon, while visiting an ancient owl who lived in a towering baobab tree, Juma finally received a clue. The owl had seen much from her perch high above the forest and was known for her deep wisdom. "There is a shadow moving in the forest, Juma," the owl said softly, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "A jackal, to be precise. She is clever, perhaps more clever than you realize. Her name is Zuri, and she has been stirring trouble where she can." Juma's eyes narrowed as he listened. A jackal? He hadn't expected this. He had been so focused on Kazi that he hadn't considered the possibility of another threat. But now, with the owl's words ringing in his ears, everything began to make sense. "Zuri," Juma murmured to himself. "So she's the one spreading the rumors." The owl nodded slowly. "Beware, Juma. Zuri is cunning. She works in the shadows, and her tricks may be harder to spot than Kazi's. But don't underestimate her. She seeks to challenge you, and if you're not careful, she may succeed." Juma thanked the owl and left her tree deep in thought. This was a new kind of enemy. Zuri wasn't like Kazi. She was more subtle, more dangerous. And she wasn't just trying to defeat him. She was trying to turn the entire forest against him. Juma knew he couldn't let Zuri continue to spread lies about him. He needed to confront her directly, to expose her deception before the forest lost all faith in him. But he had to be careful. Zuri was smart, and if he wasn't cautious, she could twist his words and make him look like the villain. Juma decided to track her down. Using his keen senses and knowledge of the forest, he followed the trail of whispers and rumors, always keeping his eyes and ears open for any sign of the jackal. It wasn't long before Juma found her. Zuri was lounging near a small clearing, casually speaking with a group of animals. Her voice was smooth and reassuring, but Juma could hear the manipulation behind her words. Stepping out from the trees, Juma approached the group. "Zuri," he called out, his voice steady but firm. "I've heard you've been speaking about me." Zuri's sharp eyes flicked toward Juma, and a slow smile spread across her face. "Ah, Juma, how nice to see you. I was just having a friendly chat with some of our forest friends." "Friendly?" Juma asked, crossing his arms. "Or are you trying to turn them against me?" Zuri tilted her head, her smile never wavering. "Oh, Juma, why would I ever do that? I'm simply speaking the truth. It's not my fault if others feel that you've changed." Juma narrowed his eyes. "I haven't changed, Zuri, but I see what you're trying to do. You think you can take my place by spreading lies, but I won't let that happen." Zuri's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Take your place? I have no such desire, Juma. I'm only interested in ensuring that the forest is led by someone wise and fair. If that's you, then so be it. But if not, well, we'll see." Juma realized then that this confrontation wouldn't be simple. Zuri was too skilled with words, too good at twisting the truth. He couldn't defeat her through direct confrontation. He would need to outsmart her, just as he had outsmarted Kazi. After his encounter with Zuri, Juma knew that the jackal wasn't going to back down. She was playing a long game, subtly turning the animals of the forest against him while keeping her own hands clean. If Juma wasn't careful, she could succeed. But Juma wasn't going to sit back and let that happen. He had faced challenges before, and he knew that cleverness and patience were his greatest allies. Zuri might be skilled at manipulation, but Juma had something she didn't: the trust of those who truly knew him. Over the next few days, Juma focused on rebuilding the relationships that Zuri had tried to undermine. He spent time with the animals, reminding them of the importance of wisdom, trust, and unity in the forest. He told stories that highlighted the value of working together, subtly countering the lies that Zuri had spread. Meanwhile, Juma also began to watch Zuri more closely. He studied her movements, her conversations, and the way she interacted with the other animals. Juma was looking for a weakness, a flaw in her strategy that he could exploit. It was clear now that the battle between him and Zuri was just beginning. This wasn't about strength or brute force anymore. It was about influence, trust, and control of the forest's heart. Juma was ready for the challenge. He had defeated Kazi with cleverness and quick thinking, and now he would use those same skills to outsmart the jackal. The once harmonious forest began to show signs of division. Zuri's whispers had started to take root, and some of the forest animals began to question Juma's leadership. The seeds of doubt had been planted. The smaller animals, especially those who hadn't seen Juma's cleverness firsthand, were the most affected by Zuri's manipulation. They whispered among themselves, wondering if Juma had grown too confident after his victory over Kazi. Was he truly looking out for the best interests of the forest, or was he only focused on his own cleverness? But not everyone was swayed by the rumors. Juma still had allies, those who had seen his wisdom in action and trusted his leadership. The older animals, the birds, and those who had relied on Juma's intelligence to guide them through difficult times remained loyal. The forest was now divided into two camps, those who supported Juma and those who, under Zuri's influence, began to question his intentions. The balance of power in the forest was beginning to shift. Juma could feel the tension rising, but he knew that confronting Zuri head-on would only play into her hands. He needed a different approach. If Zuri's strength lay in manipulation, then Juma would have to outmaneuver her without causing a direct conflict. He had to regain the trust of those who doubted him. Juma knew that one of the best ways to rebuild trust was through stories. Throughout the history of the forest, tales had been passed down from one generation to the next, teaching lessons of bravery, wisdom, and unity. Juma realized that he could use the power of storytelling to remind the animals of the values they held dear. One evening, as the forest animals gathered in a large clearing, Juma began to tell a story, a tale of a time when the animals had faced a great threat, and only by working together had they been able to overcome it. It was a story of trust and collaboration, where cleverness alone wasn't enough, and only through unity had the forest survived. The animals listened closely as Juma spoke, his voice carrying through the quiet night air. Even those who had doubted him couldn't help but be drawn in by the tale. Juma spoke of the importance of relying on one another, of knowing that cleverness had to be balanced with wisdom and honesty. As he finished the story, Juma looked out at the animals and said, "The strength of our forest isn't in any one of us. It's in all of us. When we trust each other and work together, there's nothing we can't overcome. That's the lesson I've learned, and it's the lesson we must all carry forward." The animals murmured in agreement, and Juma could see some of the doubt fading from their eyes. The power of stories had worked once again. Zuri, watching from the shadows, was not pleased with Juma's growing influence. She had seen how his storytelling had begun to sway the animals back to his side, and she knew she needed to act quickly if she wanted to maintain control of the narrative she had created. Zuri wasn't one to give up easily, and she understood that if Juma was playing the long game, then she would need to up the ante. It was time to stir the pot even further. The next morning, Zuri began spreading a new rumor, one that was more direct and more dangerous than the last. She whispered to the animals that Juma wasn't just clever, he was manipulating them. She claimed that his stories were nothing more than a way to gain power, that he wanted to control the forest for his own benefit. "Juma speaks of unity," Zuri told a group of rabbits, her voice low and conspiratorial. "But how can we trust someone who always seems to be out for himself? How can we be sure that he isn't using his cleverness to make us all dependent on him? The rumor spread like wildfire. Doubt began to grow once again, and this time it was more dangerous. If the animals believed that Juma was manipulating them, it could undo all the trust he had worked so hard to build. Zuri watched with satisfaction as the forest once again began to murmur with uncertainty. Her plan was working. As Zuri's rumors spread, Juma noticed that some of the animals who had been supportive after his storytelling were now acting distant again. He realized that Zuri had doubled down on her deception, and the forest was once again teetering on the edge of division. But Juma wasn't one to panic. He knew that fear and uncertainty were Zuri's greatest weapons, and the only way to counter them was to stand firm in his principles. Trust couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. One afternoon, as Juma swung through the trees, he was approached by a group of younger animals who had begun to question him again. They were nervous but curious, wanting to understand what was really going on. "Juma," one of the younger squirrels said hesitantly, "we've been hearing things, that you're using your cleverness to control the forest. Is it true?" Juma paused, looking down at the group with kind eyes. He could see the doubt and fear in their expressions, and he knew this was a crucial moment. This wasn't just about his reputation, it was about the future of the entire forest. "Look around you," Juma said softly, gesturing to the trees, the river, and the animals moving through the forest. "Everything we have, everything we are, is because we trust each other. Yes, I'm clever, but I've never used that to control anyone. I've used it to protect the forest, to help us all survive." The animals listened closely, their doubts slowly melting away. Juma continued, "Zuri may want you to think that I'm only out for myself, but that's not true. I've always believed that the strength of this forest comes from the trust we have in each other. If I've done anything wrong, it's only because I care too much about keeping us safe." The younger animals looked at one another, then back at Juma. Slowly, they began to nod, understanding that Zuri's rumors were nothing more than lies. Loyalty was being restored, one conversation at a time. As the tension between Juma and Zuri escalated, Kazi watched from the river, conflicted. He had given Juma his word that he would no longer harm him or the other animals, but Zuri's manipulations were tempting. The jackal had offered Kazi a way to undermine Juma without breaking his promise. And Kazi found himself at a crossroads. Kazi's pride still burned from his defeat, and a part of him longed to see Juma fall. But another part of him, the part that had grown to respect Juma's cleverness, was hesitant to align with Zuri. The jackal's methods were underhanded, even for a predator like Kazi. One evening, as Kazi rested on the riverbank, Tiva approached him, sensing his inner turmoil. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly. "Are you still thinking about Zuri's offer?" Kazi nodded. "I am, but something doesn't feel right. Juma may have outsmarted me, but he did it fairly. Zuri, on the other hand, I'm not sure I can trust her." Tiva nodded in agreement. "Zuri is dangerous, Kazi. She doesn't care about the forest or its balance. She only cares about power. If you side with her, you may get your revenge on Juma, but at what cost?" Kazi sighed deeply, torn between his desire for revenge and his growing sense of honor. Zuri's deception was tempting, but Kazi was beginning to see that there was more at stake than just his pride. "I need to think," Kazi said finally, turning back to the river. "This isn't a decision I can make lightly." And so, Kazi remained on the riverbank, contemplating his next move, as the forest around him continued to shift and change. The fate of the forest was no longer just in Juma's hands, but in Kazi's as well. The tension in the forest continued to rise. Zuri's rumors had spread so widely that even the wisest animals were beginning to feel uneasy. The unity that Juma had worked so hard to build was now fragile, like a thin thread stretched to its limit. The storm wasn't just coming, it was already here. Juma could sense the change in the air. Everywhere he went, he felt the eyes of the animals watching him, uncertain and suspicious. Even his closest allies, though still loyal, seemed hesitant, as if waiting for something to break. One afternoon, Juma sat high in a baobab tree overlooking the forest. He had always prided himself on his cleverness, his ability to outsmart those who tried to harm him. But this was different. This wasn't a battle of strength or speed, it was a battle for hearts and minds. As he watched the sun begin to set over the trees, Juma realized that his greatest challenge wasn't Kazi, Zuri, or even the forest's shifting loyalties. His greatest challenge was learning how to lead in a time of uncertainty. How could he inspire trust when doubt had already taken root? Juma closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The answer, he knew, was not in clever tricks or bold moves. It was in patience, in listening, and in staying true to the values that had always guided him. He had to trust the forest, just as he asked the forest to trust him. Zuri, on the other hand, was thriving in the uncertainty she had created. The forest was more divided than ever, and the animals were looking to her for guidance. She moved through the trees with confidence, knowing that each whisper, each rumor had brought her closer to her goal. But Zuri wasn't content with just spreading doubt. She wanted power. And to get that power, she needed to fully discredit Juma. His cleverness, his wisdom, his reputation, everything had to be torn down if she was going to rise to the top. Zuri knew that Juma was careful, always watching for any sign of danger. But she also knew that even the most clever animals could be caught off guard. All she needed was one mistake, one slip, and the forest would turn against him for good. So Zuri began to weave her web tighter. She whispered to the animals that Juma had grown distant, that he was too focused on himself to care about the rest of the forest. She hinted that perhaps Juma had made deals with Kazi, that the two were secretly working together to control the forest. The animals, already uncertain, began to believe her. The idea that Juma and Kazi could be in league with one another seemed far-fetched. But in a forest divided by fear, even the most outrageous rumors could take hold. Zuri watched with satisfaction as the forest animals began to turn on Juma, questioning everything they had once believed. Her web was almost complete. As Zuri's influence grew, Juma knew that he needed to act quickly. But instead of confronting Zuri directly, he decided to take a different approach. He would meet with Kazi. Juma had no reason to trust the crocodile, but he also knew that Kazi had been silent ever since their last encounter. Something had changed in Kazi, and Juma needed to understand what the crocodile was thinking if he was going to survive Zuri's plot. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Juma made his way to the riverbank where Kazi often rested. The crocodile was there, his massive body half submerged in the water, his eyes closed as if in deep thought. "Kazi," Juma called from a safe distance, his voice calm but firm. Kazi opened one eye and looked at Juma with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "What do you want, monkey?" he growled, though there was less anger in his voice than there had been before. "I need to talk to you," Juma replied, stepping closer but keeping to the trees. "Not about the past, about the present, about Zuri." Kazi narrowed his eyes. "Zuri? What about her?" "She's manipulating the forest," Juma said plainly. "She's turning the animals against me, and she's trying to use you to do it. I know you gave your word that you wouldn't harm me, but Zuri doesn't care about promises. She'll use whatever means necessary to take control of the forest." Kazi listened, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a sigh, he pulled himself out of the water and settled onto the riverbank, his massive tail curling around him. "You think I don't know that?" Kazi rumbled. "Zuri came to me with her little schemes, whispering in my ear about revenge. But I'm not a fool, Juma. I know she's dangerous, and I haven't forgotten my promise." Juma nodded, relieved but still cautious. "Then we need to work together. If we don't, the entire forest could fall under Zuri's control." Kazi's eyes gleamed with a flicker of interest. "Work together? You and me?" Juma smiled faintly. "I never thought I'd say it either, but sometimes the enemy of your enemy is your friend." Kazi remained silent for a long time, weighing Juma's words. An alliance with the clever monkey who had outsmarted him. The idea was almost laughable. But deep down, Kazi knew Juma was right. Zuri was dangerous, and if she succeeded, she would control not just the forest but the river as well. "I'll agree to work with you," Kazi said slowly, "but only because I don't trust Zuri." "Don't think this makes us friends, monkey." Juma chuckled. "I wouldn't expect anything less." With their uneasy alliance formed, Juma and Kazi began to plan. They both knew that Zuri was clever, but she had one weakness, her overconfidence. She believed she had already won, that the forest was fully under her influence. But Juma and Kazi knew that if they could expose her deception, The animals would see her for what she truly was. The plan was simple. Juma would continue to rebuild trust with the animals, while Kazi would gather information from the river creatures who had been speaking with Zuri. They would work in secret, allowing Zuri to believe that she had already won. It was a dangerous game, but both Juma and Kazi knew it was the only way to stop Zuri from taking over the forest. As they parted ways, Kazi gave Juma one final warning. "Don't trust anyone too easily, monkey. Zuri's tricks run deep, and if you're not careful, you could end up as her next victim." Juma nodded, understanding the weight of Kazi's words. The forest had become a battlefield of wits, and only the cleverest would survive. With their plan in motion, Juma and Kazi began to work quietly, each in their own way. Juma continued to meet with the animals, sharing stories of trust and unity, slowly regaining their confidence. He spoke of the values that had always guided the forest, reminding the animals that they were stronger together than they were apart. Meanwhile, Kazi moved through the river, speaking with the creatures who had been in contact with Zuri. The crocodile's presence was enough to make even the boldest animals nervous, and they quickly revealed what they knew. Zuri had been manipulating them, promising power and safety in exchange for their loyalty. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Juma and Kazi were able to gather enough information to expose Zuri's deception. But they couldn't act just yet. They needed the perfect moment, when all eyes were on Zuri, to reveal her lies. As the days passed, Zuri grew more confident, believing that her web of influence was complete. She had no idea that Juma and Kazi were working together. The trap was set. All that was left was to wait for Zuri to make her next move, and when she did, Juma and Kazi would be ready. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. Animals moved cautiously, their eyes darting from one another as whispers of rumors, alliances, and suspicion continued to swirl. Even the trees seemed tense, their branches swaying as if aware that something big was about to happen. Juma noticed this shift as he moved through the treetops. He had been working tirelessly to rebuild trust, but he could sense the unease that Zuri's manipulation had sown. Trust, once broken, was hard to mend, and Zuri had done a masterful job of spreading her deceit. Juma had to be careful. Zuri was smart, and her web of lies was vast. But he had Kazi now, and their plan was nearing completion. All they needed was for Zuri to make a critical mistake, one that would expose her true intentions to the forest. But as the animals grew more uneasy, Juma knew they couldn't wait much longer. The forest was on the brink of breaking, and if Zuri wasn't stopped soon, chaos would follow. Zuri, confident in her control over the forest, decided it was time to make her final move. She had done her work in the shadows, planting doubts and stirring the pot, but now it was time to step into the light. She would challenge Juma publicly, forcing him to face her in front of the entire forest. One afternoon, as the animals gathered by the river for their usual meetings, Zuri made her entrance. She walked confidently through the crowd, her tail swaying behind her, a sly smile on her face. The animals parted as she passed, their eyes filled with a mix of awe and fear. Zuri had become a powerful presence in the forest. "Friends," Zuri called out, her voice smooth and commanding, "for too long we have lived in uncertainty. For too long we have been led by someone who claims to be clever, but who hides from the truth. Today I challenge Juma to show himself, to explain why he has kept us all in the dark." The crowd murmured in confusion, turning to see if Juma would answer Zuri's challenge. Some of the animals, still loyal to Juma, frowned at Zuri's boldness, but many were curious. This was what Zuri wanted, to push Juma into a corner where he couldn't escape. Juma, watching from the trees, knew this was the moment he and Kazi had been waiting for. It was time to spring the trap. From the shadows of the trees, Juma stepped into the clearing, his expression calm but resolute. The forest animals fell silent as they watched him approach. They had seen Juma outsmart Kazi, but this was different. This was a battle for their loyalty, their trust. Zuri's eyes gleamed as she saw Juma approach. "Ah, there you are, Juma," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "I was beginning to think you would hide forever." Juma didn't respond to Zuri's taunt. Instead, he turned to face the crowd of animals, his voice clear and steady. "I have nothing to hide from you," he began, his gaze sweeping over the gathered creatures. I've always acted in the best interests of the forest, and I stand by my choices. But Zuri has been lying to you." The animals gasped, their eyes darting between Juma and Zuri. Zuri laughed, shaking her head. "Lying? Me? Oh, Juma, you've lost your touch. I've only been telling the truth that you refuse to admit." Juma took a deep breath. "Zuri claims to be on your side, but she's been spreading lies to divide us, to make us doubt one another. She wants control of the forest, not peace, and I can prove it." The crowd leaned in, intrigued by Juma's confidence. Zuri's smile faltered for the first time as Juma continued. "Kazi, would you like to join us?" At Juma's call, the massive form of Kazi emerged from the river, his dark eyes gleaming with an intensity that made the crowd shudder. The animals, who had feared the crocodile for so long, watched in stunned silence as Kazi slithered forward to stand beside Juma. Zuri's eyes widened in disbelief. Kazi and Juma, working together? This was not part of her plan. "Zuri came to me," Kazi said, his deep voice booming over the gathered animals. "She whispered in my ear, tempting me with promises of revenge against Juma. She wanted me to break my word, to go back on the promise I made to this forest." The animals gasped again, and Zuri's confident smile slipped entirely. She glared at Kazi, but the crocodile wasn't finished. "But I didn't take her offer," Kazi continued, "because I realized that Zuri doesn't care about this forest. She only cares about power. She's been manipulating you all, using your fears against you." Juma was right. Zuri's calm facade finally cracked. "You think you can trust Kazi? He's a crocodile, a predator. He's just trying to save himself." Kazi snarled, showing his sharp teeth. "I've done things I'm not proud of, but at least I'm honest about what I've done. You, Zuri, you've been lying to everyone, and now the truth is out." The crowd, shocked and unsure, began murmuring among themselves. Some of them were still afraid of Kazi, but others could see that what he and Juma were saying made sense. Zuri's lies were beginning to unravel. Seeing her plans fall apart before her eyes, Zuri tried one last desperate move. "You're all fools," she shouted, her voice sharp and venomous. "Juma and Kazi are working together to control you. Can't you see? They're the real threat, not me." But the animals weren't listening anymore. They had seen the way Zuri had twisted the truth, how she had tried to manipulate them into turning against Juma. Slowly, the tide of the forest's loyalty began to shift back toward the clever monkey. One by one, the animals turned their backs on Zuri, no longer swayed by her lies. The jackal, realizing that she had lost, began to back away, her once confident demeanor crumbling. She had underestimated the power of truth and the unity of the forest. Juma, seeing Zuri's downfall, stepped forward and addressed the animals once more. "We are stronger when we trust one another." Zuri wanted to break that trust, but together, we've shown that lies and deceit have no place in this forest. The animals cheered in agreement, and Zuri, now alone, slunk into the shadows, her tail between her legs. Her reign of manipulation was over. As the crowd dispersed, Juma and Kazi stood side by side, their unlikely alliance having saved the forest from division. Juma turned to Kazi and offered a small smile. "Thank you, Kazi. I didn't think we'd ever work together, but I'm glad we did." Kazi grunted, his expression thoughtful. "You may have outsmarted me, monkey, but today, we both won." In the days following Zuri's downfall, the forest began to breathe a sigh of relief. The tension that had hung over the trees like a dark cloud was slowly lifting, and the animals started to go about their daily lives with a renewed sense of peace. The forest, once divided by fear and deceit, was beginning to heal. But for Juma, the victory felt bittersweet. Though Zuri had been exposed and the animals had rallied behind him, the wounds of mistrust ran deep. It would take time for the forest to fully return to the harmony it once had. Trust, once broken, needed careful tending. Juma spent his days visiting the different parts of the forest, speaking with the animals, reassuring them that the danger had passed. He knew that Zuri's deception had shaken their faith, not just in him, but in one another. His role now was to remind them of the values they had always shared: unity, wisdom, and trust. Kazi, on the other hand, remained by the river, keeping his distance from the rest of the forest. Though he had helped Juma bring down Zuri, he was still seen as a predator, a figure of fear and danger. And while Kazi no longer sought to harm Juma, the crocodile knew that his place in the forest was a complicated one. Both Juma and Kazi had won a battle, But the forest's recovery was just beginning. As the days passed, Kazi found himself deep in thought. For years, he had been feared by the animals of the forest, and he had embraced that fear, using his strength and cunning to his advantage. But now, things were different. He had worked with Juma, and in doing so, he had shown the forest that even a predator could change. But Kazi wasn't sure what his future held. The animals still kept their distance, and even though he had kept his word to Juma, he could feel that the forest wasn't ready to accept him as anything more than a dangerous presence. One afternoon, as Kazi rested by the riverbank, Kiva approached him. She had been watching him closely, sensing the internal conflict he was wrestling with. "You've been quiet," Kiva said softly, settling beside him. "Are you still thinking about Juma and the forest?" Kazi grunted, not meeting her eyes. "I did what I had to do, but it doesn't change anything. They still see me as a threat." Kiva nodded thoughtfully. "It's not easy to change how others see you, Kazi, but you did something important. You kept your promise. Maybe the forest won't accept you right away, but over time, they'll come to see that you're more than just a predator." Kazi sighed deeply. "I'm not sure if that's possible. My place has always been here in the river. I don't know if I belong anywhere else." Kiva smiled gently. "You'll find your place, Kazi. It may not be with them, but you've shown that you're capable of more than just fear and force. You've proven yourself." Kazi remained silent, still unsure of what the future held. But deep down, he knew that he had taken a step toward something greater. For the first time in his life, Kazi wondered if there was more to his story than being a feared predator. While Kazi reflected on the river, Juma focused on healing the forest. The animals, still recovering from Zuri's manipulation, needed time to rebuild their sense of community. Juma knew that his role was not just as a clever monkey, but as a leader who could guide the forest through this period of uncertainty. Each day, Juma gathered the animals together in small groups, sharing stories of trust and cooperation. He reminded them of the times they had overcome challenges by relying on one another. And slowly, the animals began to trust again. The fear that Zuri had instilled was starting to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of unity. One morning, as Juma sat with a group of young animals, a wise old tortoise approached him. The tortoise, who had lived through many seasons, had seen the forest face countless challenges, and he was known for his calm, steady wisdom. "You've done well, Juma," the tortoise said in his slow, measured voice. "The forest is healing because of your efforts. But remember, it will take time. Trust is like a seed, it must be nurtured to grow." Juma nodded thoughtfully. "I know. It's hard though. Sometimes it feels like the forest will never be the same again." The tortoise smiled gently. "The forest is always changing, Juma. It will never be exactly as it was, but that doesn't mean it can't be stronger, wiser, and more united than before. You've shown us that wisdom and trust are more important than power. That lesson will stay with the forest for many seasons to come." Juma felt a sense of calm wash over him. The path to healing would be long, but with patience and persistence, the forest would find its way back to peace. As the forest slowly returned to normal, something unexpected began to happen. The animals, seeing the bond that had formed between Juma and Kazi, began to talk about the possibility of a new kind of alliance, one between the forest and the river. For so long, the river had been seen as a dangerous boundary, a place where the crocodiles lurked, waiting to pounce on any animal that ventured too close. But now, with Kazi's help in bringing down Zuri, the animals were beginning to wonder if there could be peace between the forest and the river. One afternoon, as Juma swung through the trees, a group of animals approached him with a request. "Juma," said a young deer, "we've been talking, and we think it might be time to open up a conversation with the river creatures. If Kazi was willing to work with you, maybe the others are too." Juma paused, considering the idea. It was true. Kazi had shown that even a predator could be trusted under the right circumstances. But could the rest of the river creatures follow his example? "I'll think about it," Juma said, his mind already racing with possibilities. The idea of peace between the forest and the river was something new, something that could change the balance of the forest forever. But it would take careful planning, and Juma knew he couldn't rush into it. If there was to be peace, it would need to be built on a foundation of trust. And trust, as he had learned, took time. One evening, as the sun set over the river, Juma found himself standing at the water's edge, gazing out at the reflection of the trees in the calm waters. He had come here to think, to clear his mind after a long day of speaking with the animals about their vision of peace between the forest and the river. As Juma stood there, lost in thought, he heard the familiar sound of Kazi's heavy footsteps approaching from the water. The crocodile emerged from the river, his massive form casting a long shadow over the shore. "You've been busy," Kazi remarked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "The animals are talking about you in the river. They think we can make peace." Juma smiled faintly. "I didn't expect it, but it seems like they believe it's possible." Kazi snorted. "You really think a bunch of forest animals can trust the river? They've feared us for generations. It's not that simple." Juma turned to face Kazi, his expression thoughtful. "It won't be easy, but you proved something, Kazi. You showed them that even a predator can be trusted if there's a reason to trust. Maybe this is the start of something new." Kazi remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the river. "Maybe, but don't expect the rest of the river creatures to be as patient as I've been." Juma chuckled. "I wouldn't dream of it." The two stood there in silence for a while, watching the river flow quietly by. It was an odd sight, a clever monkey and a fearsome crocodile, side by side, contemplating the future of the forest and the river. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time, there was a sense of hope, a possibility that the forest and the river could find a way to live in harmony. Juma and Kazi, once bitter enemies, now shared an understanding that went beyond their differences. An unlikely friendship had begun to form, one that could change the forest forever. Juma's conversations with the animals continued, and slowly the idea of peace between the forest and the river began to take root. What once seemed impossible was now a real possibility, a chance for the creatures of the river and the forest to live in harmony. But Juma knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. The fear of the river creatures, especially the crocodiles, ran deep. Generations of forest animals had learned to avoid the riverbanks, knowing that crossing paths with a crocodile could mean certain death. It would take more than just clever words to change that. Juma decided that the first step toward peace had to be a gesture of trust. If the forest animals could see that the river creatures were willing to meet them halfway, it might begin to heal the old wounds of fear and mistrust. One afternoon, Juma approached Kazi with the idea. "The animals of the forest are willing to talk, but they need to see that the river creatures can be trusted. We need to arrange a meeting. Something peaceful, something that shows both sides are willing to listen." Kazi narrowed his eyes, thinking carefully. "You're asking a lot, monkey. The river creatures aren't exactly social." "I'm not asking for all of them," Juma replied. "Just a few. You, and maybe some others who are willing to try." Kazi sighed, his massive tail flicking the water. "I'll see what I can do, but don't expect this to be easy. Crocodiles aren't known for their diplomacy." Juma smiled. "I didn't expect it to be easy, Kazi, but it's a start." Convincing Kazi to participate in the meeting was one thing. Convincing the rest of the river creatures was another matter entirely. Kazi swam deep into the heart of the river, where the other crocodiles and river creatures gathered. The idea of peace with the forest was met with skepticism, and in some cases, outright hostility. One particularly large crocodile named Baku, known for his short temper and strength, scoffed at the idea. "Peace with the forest? Have you lost your mind, Kazi? We've lived by our own rules for generations. Why should we change now?" Kazi, though aware of the resistance, remained calm. "Things are changing, Baku. The forest is growing stronger, and the old ways aren't going to work forever. If we don't adapt, we'll be left behind." Baku sneered, his teeth gleaming in the dim light beneath the water. "I don't care about the forest or the monkeys swinging through the trees. We're crocodiles. We rule the river, and that's all that matters." Kazi knew that reasoning with someone like Baku was nearly impossible, but there were others in the river who were more open-minded. Some of the smaller creatures, the fish, frogs, and otters, had always lived in fear of the crocodiles and were intrigued by the idea of peace. A small otter named Lani approached Kazi after Baku had left. "I think this meeting could be a good thing," she said softly. "The river isn't always safe for us. If the forest and river could find a way to live together, maybe things could change. Kazi nodded, grateful for Lani's support. It's a start. We'll need all the help we can get. The day of the meeting arrived. It had taken careful planning, and Juma had worked tirelessly to ensure that the forest animals were ready to approach the river with open minds. He had chosen a small group, those who were most willing to give the river creatures a chance. The meeting took place at the riverbank, where the forest and the river met, a place that had always been a boundary between the two worlds. Now, it was becoming a meeting ground. On one side stood Juma, accompanied by a few trusted forest animals, including the wise old tortoise, a parrot, and a deer. On the other side, Kazi emerged from the water, flanked by Lani the otter and a small group of river creatures. Baku had refused to attend, still clinging to his belief that the river needed no alliance with the forest. The two groups eyed each other warily, years of mistrust still lingering in the air. But Juma stepped forward with a smile, his voice calm and welcoming. "Thank you all for coming. This is a moment we've been working toward for a long time. We're here to see if the forest and the river can finally live in peace." Kazi, though less comfortable with words, nodded in agreement. "The river has its ways, just as the forest does, but maybe we can learn something from each other." The animals on both sides were quiet, watching, waiting. It was a tense moment, but Juma knew that this was the first step toward something bigger. The forest and the river were finally talking. The meeting at the riverbank ended without incident, but the peace that had been discussed was fragile. Both sides were still hesitant, unsure if they could truly trust one another. Over the next few days, Juma and Kazi worked to strengthen the newfound alliance. Juma continued to speak with the forest animals, encouraging them to give the river creatures a chance. He reminded them that fear and distrust were obstacles that could be overcome with time and patience. Kazi, meanwhile, faced a different challenge. Though some of the river creatures had been willing to attend the meeting, many remained unconvinced. Baku, in particular, was vocal about his opposition to the idea of peace. "The forest animals will never accept us," he snarled. "We should have nothing to do with them." But Kazi was determined to make this work. He had seen what division had done to the forest when Zuri was in control, and he knew that a united forest and river would be stronger than either side alone. However, Kazi also knew that Baku's resistance was dangerous. If the larger crocodiles chose to reject the idea of peace, the fragile alliance could shatter before it had a chance to grow. Despite the challenges, Juma and Kazi continued to work together, knowing that true peace wouldn't come easily. The road ahead was long, but they had taken the first step. As dawn approached, Baku's plan was set in motion. The river wasn't as peaceful as it seemed, and soon, Juma and Kazi would face their greatest challenge yet. Tensions in the river grew sharper as Baku's influence spread. The larger crocodiles, who had once followed Kazi without question, now began to whisper among themselves, wondering if their leader had gone soft. Baku's rebellion was gaining momentum, and it was clear that a confrontation was inevitable. Juma, unaware of the growing unrest in the river, continued his work with the forest animals, confident that the peace he and Kazi had fostered was beginning to take root. But as the days passed, Juma noticed a change in Kazi. The crocodile seemed more distant, his usual gruffness replaced by a sense of unease. One evening, as Juma approached the riverbank to speak with Kazi, he found the crocodile staring into the water, lost in thought. "Kazi," Juma called, his voice careful. "Something's bothering you. What is it?" Kazi didn't respond at first, but after a long silence, he sighed. "It's Baku. He's not happy about this peace. He's gathering support from the other crocodiles, and I don't know how long I can hold them off." Juma's heart sank. He had suspected that not everyone would be eager to embrace the alliance, but the thought of an outright rebellion hadn't crossed his mind. "We can't let Baku destroy what we've worked for," Juma said, his tone urgent. "We need to find a way to stop him." Kazi nodded, though his eyes were heavy with doubt. "Easier said than done, monkey. Baku's strong, and he's not one to back down easily." Juma clenched his fists, determination rising within him. The peace they had fought so hard to build was at risk, and they couldn't afford to let Baku tear it apart. Juma knew that if they were going to stand a chance against Baku's rebellion, they needed support. both from the forest and the river. It wasn't just about stopping one angry crocodile, it was about showing both sides that the alliance was worth defending. The next morning, Juma gathered his most trusted allies, the wise old tortoise, the parrot, and the young deer who had been part of the first meeting. Together, they discussed how to approach the situation. The forest had to be ready. We need to make it clear to the animals that this peace isn't just about avoiding conflict, Juma explained. It's about creating a future where the forest and the river can work together. If we let fear rule us, we'll never move forward. The old tortoise nodded thoughtfully. Fear is a powerful force, Juma, but trust can be stronger. You've shown that time and again. Meanwhile, Kazi faced his own challenge. He approached the river creatures, speaking with the smaller animals like Lani the otter and some of the fish who had supported the peace. Though they feared Baku, they didn't want to return to the days when the river was ruled by fear and strength alone. I won't let Baku destroy this, Kazi told them, his voice firm. But I can't do it alone. We need to stand together. Lani, always brave despite her small size, stepped forward. We're with you, Kazi. The river can be more than just a place of fear. It was a fragile alliance, but it was a start. Juma and Kazi were gathering their forces, preparing for the confrontation that was sure to come. As the days passed, Baku's rebellion grew bolder. The large crocodile had rallied a group of followers, and they began to assert their dominance over the river once more, pushing the smaller creatures into the shadows. The balance of power in the river was shifting, and Baku was ready to make his move. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the river, Baku made his intentions clear. He emerged from the water, his powerful body casting a long shadow across the riverbank, and called out to Kazi. Kazi! Baku's voice boomed across the water, sending ripples through the river. You've led us into weakness. This so-called peace with the forest is a betrayal of who we are. It's time to step down. Kazi emerged from the river, his expression calm but tense. He had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. Baku, this isn't about weakness. It's about survival. The world is changing, and if we don't change with it, we'll be left behind. Baku snarled, baring his sharp teeth. You've lost your way, Kazi. You've let that monkey fill your head with nonsense. The river belongs to us, and we won't share it with the forest. Kazi stood his ground, his eyes locked on Baku's. This isn't just about the river anymore, Baku. It's about what's best for all of us. We can't keep living in fear. Baku's eyes gleamed with anger. If you won't step down, then I'll take control by force. The tension in the air was thick, and the creatures of the river watched in silence, waiting to see how the confrontation would unfold. It was clear that Baku wasn't just challenging Kazi's leadership, he was challenging the very idea of peace. The showdown between Kazi and Baku had drawn a crowd. Both river and forest creatures had gathered at the water's edge, unsure of what would happen next. The fragile peace was hanging by a thread, and everyone knew that this moment could define the future of the forest and the river. Juma arrived just in time to see Kazi and Baku facing off. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized how close they were to losing everything they had worked for. He couldn't let that happen. Kazi! Juma called out, stepping forward from the trees. You don't have to do this alone. Kazi turned slightly, acknowledging Juma with a nod. But his focus remained on Baku, who was glaring at Juma with open disdain. This is between me and Kazi, Baku growled. Stay out of it, monkey. Juma didn't back down. This isn't just about you and Kazi, it's about the future of the river and the forest. Baku, you're fighting to hold on to the past, but the world is changing. If we don't change with it, we'll all be destroyed. Baku sneered. You think your clever words will stop me? I've led the river before, and I'll do it again. We don't need peace, we need strength. Juma took a deep breath. Strength doesn't come from fear, Baku. It comes from unity. We've seen what happens when we fight among ourselves. Zuri tried to divide the forest, and it nearly destroyed us. If you keep this up, you'll do the same to the river. Baku hesitated for a moment, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to prove his dominance. But Kazi, standing tall beside Juma, was no longer willing to be ruled by fear. This isn't about me or you, Baku. It's about the river, and I'm not stepping down. Baku's eyes narrowed, his muscles tensing as he prepared to strike. It was clear that words alone wouldn't resolve this conflict. The time for talking was over. With a sudden roar, Baku lunged at Kazi, his jaws snapping with deadly force. The two crocodiles collided with a thunderous crash, their powerful bodies thrashing in the shallow water as they fought for control of the river. The animals on the shore watched in horror as the battle unfolded. Kazi, though strong, was at a disadvantage. Baku's sheer size and aggression made him a formidable opponent. But Kazi fought with determination, refusing to let Baku's rebellion undo everything he and Juma had worked for. Juma, standing at the edge of the water, felt helpless. He couldn't intervene in the fight. This was a battle between crocodiles, and it was one that Kazi had to win on his own. But Juma knew that the outcome of this fight would decide the future of the forest and the river. If Kazi fell, Baku would take control, and the peace they had built would crumble. The fight raged on, the water churning as the two crocodiles grappled with one another. Baku was relentless, but Kazi fought with a calm focus that belied his strength. Every move was calculated, every strike precise. This wasn't just a fight for dominance, it was a fight for the future. As the battle reached its peak, Kazi saw an opening. With a swift, powerful strike, he knocked Baku off balance, sending the larger crocodile crashing into the riverbank. Baku roared in frustration, but Kazi didn't relent. With one final push, Kazi pinned Baku to the ground, his jaws inches from Baku's neck. For a moment, everything was silent. The animals watched, waiting to see what Kazi would do. He had won, but would he finish Baku, or would he show mercy? Kazi, breathing heavily, locked eyes with Baku. "I could end this," Kazi said, his voice low and steady. "But that's not the kind of leader I am. We don't need more fear. We need peace." Slowly, Kazi released his grip on Baku, stepping back and allowing the defeated crocodile to rise. Baku, humiliated but alive, said nothing as he slunk back into the river, his rebellion crushed. The animals, both from the forest and the river, looked at Kazi with newfound respect. He had proven that strength didn't come from fear or dominance, it came from wisdom and unity. Juma stepped forward, a small smile on his face. "I think you just saved the river, Kazi." Kazi nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but it's not just the river we saved, it's the future of both our worlds." Juma and Kazi stood together at the riverbank the morning after Baku's defeat, reflecting on how far they had come. The alliance between the forest and the river, once a distant dream, was now a reality. "Kazi," Juma said with a smile, "I wasn't sure we'd get this far." Kazi grunted, his usual gruffness softened by a rare hint of pride. "Neither was I, monkey, but we did. And maybe now, the forest and the river can start moving forward together." The animals of the river, especially the smaller creatures like Lani the otter and the frogs, had begun to mingle more openly with the forest animals. For the first time, the boundaries between the two worlds were dissolving, replaced by a cautious but growing trust. But Juma knew that while they had overcome Baku's rebellion, the journey toward lasting peace wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Trust would need to be nurtured, and old fears wouldn't disappear overnight. Still, the victory over Baku had shown the animals of both worlds that working together was possible. And that, Juma thought, was worth celebrating. As the days passed and the forest and river adjusted to their new reality, Juma found himself facing a new challenge. Leadership. The animals now looked to him for guidance, not just as the clever monkey who had outwitted Kazi, but as a true leader who had brought about peace. But with leadership came responsibility. Juma knew that leading through uncertain times was a delicate balance. Too much confidence, and he risked losing the animals' trust again. Too much caution, and the alliance could weaken. One afternoon, as Juma sat high in the trees, reflecting on the weight of his new role, the wise old tortoise approached him slowly. "You seem troubled, Juma," the tortoise said softly, his deep voice calm and reassuring. Juma sighed. "I didn't set out to be a leader. I just wanted to keep the forest safe. But now it feels like everyone's depending on me. What if I make the wrong choice? What if this peace doesn't last?" The tortoise nodded, understanding the burden Juma carried. Leadership is not about always knowing the right answer. It's about listening, adapting, and being humble enough to learn from your mistakes. The forest trusts you because you've earned that trust through your actions. Don't let fear stop you from leading. Juma thought about the tortoise's words. Leadership wasn't about perfection. It was about staying true to the values that had guided him all along. With renewed resolve, Juma thanked the tortoise and climbed higher into the trees, ready to face whatever challenges came next. Kazi, too, was adjusting to his new role. The once fearsome crocodile, who had ruled the river through fear and dominance, was now seen as a leader who had chosen wisdom over force. It was a strange feeling for Kazi to be respected not for his strength, but for his decision to seek peace. But Kazi's leadership was not without its challenges. Baku's followers, though no longer openly rebelling, were still wary of the peace. Some of the larger crocodiles muttered that Kazi had gone soft, that he had allowed the forest creatures to dictate the rules of the river. One evening, as Kazi rested by the riverbank, Lani the otter approached him with a look of concern. "Kazi," she said hesitantly, "I've heard some of the other crocodiles talking. They still don't trust the forest."
Kazi sighed deeply, his eyes narrowing in thought. "I know, old habits die hard, but I won't let the river return to the way it was. If we keep living in fear and mistrust, we'll tear ourselves apart." Lani nodded, her admiration for Kazi clear. "You've changed, Kazi. The river is better because of you." Kazi grunted, though there was a faint hint of pride in his voice. "Maybe, but change doesn't happen overnight. It'll take time." As Lani swam away, Kazi gazed out over the river, reflecting on his journey. He had gone from a predator driven by hunger and dominance to a leader who understood the value of peace. It was a new path for him, but one he was willing to walk. To solidify the peace between the forest and the river, Juma had an idea: a festival. A celebration of the newfound unity between the two worlds. It would be a chance for the animals to come together, not as creatures of the forest or river, but as one community. The festival, held at the edge of the river where the two worlds met, was unlike anything the forest had seen before. The trees were decorated with colorful vines, and the river shimmered under the sunlight. The animals of the forest and the river gathered, mingling and sharing food. Juma, perched on a high branch, watched as the animals, once divided by fear, now laughed and played together. It was a sight he had never imagined possible. Kazi, who usually avoided such gatherings, stood at the water's edge, watching the festivities unfold. For the first time, he saw a future where the river wasn't just a place of danger, but a place where life and peace could thrive. As the festival went on, Juma climbed down to join Kazi at the riverbank. "It's working," Juma said quietly, a smile on his face. "The forest and the river, together." Kazi grunted in agreement, though his usual gruffness had softened. "It won't be easy, monkey, but it's a start." The festival carried on long into the night, with animals of all kinds sharing stories, food, and laughter. It was a symbol of the peace that Juma and Kazi had worked so hard to achieve. The festival wasn't just a celebration of unity. It was a promise of the future. As the festival came to an end and the animals returned to their homes, Juma couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The forest and the river had come together, and peace had been restored. But deep down, Juma knew that peace was a fragile thing. It required constant care and vigilance. One evening, as Juma rested in his favorite tree, he noticed something strange in the distance. A dark cloud rising on the horizon. At first, he thought it was a storm, but as the cloud grew larger, Juma's instincts told him that this was something more. The next morning, as Juma swung through the trees, he overheard the birds talking in hushed tones about strange creatures seen on the edges of the forest. New animals, unfamiliar and different, had been spotted, and the forest was abuzz with rumors. Juma's mind raced. Could this be a new challenge? Something that could disrupt the peace they had worked so hard to build? Determined to find out more, Juma gathered his most trusted allies. "We need to investigate," he told them. "If there are new creatures in the forest, we need to understand who they are and what they want." Kazi, hearing the news, agreed to join Juma in scouting the area. The peace they had built was strong, but it could be tested by the arrival of outsiders. As they ventured toward the edges of the forest, Juma couldn't shake the feeling that this new challenge would require all the wisdom, trust, and unity they had worked so hard to achieve. As Juma and Kazi ventured to the edges of the forest, they quickly discovered signs of the newcomers. Large footprints, unlike anything they had seen before, were scattered across the ground, leading deeper into the forest. Juma crouched down, examining the prints carefully. "These tracks don't belong to any animal I know," he said, frowning. "They're too big for a deer and too light for a predator like a lion." Kazi, standing beside him, nodded. "I don't like this, Juma. We need to figure out who or what is moving through our forest." Juma and Kazi continued following the trail, their eyes sharp and ears alert. The further they went, the more signs they found: broken branches, disturbed patches of earth, and even strange claw marks on the trees. As they moved deeper into the unfamiliar territory, Juma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "We're not alone," he whispered to Kazi. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes ahead. Juma and Kazi froze, their senses heightened. Whatever was out there, it was close. Then, from the shadows, a group of large, unfamiliar creatures emerged. Tall, powerful animals with thick fur and sharp claws. They moved silently, their eyes gleaming with intelligence and caution. Juma and Kazi stood their ground, unsure of what these newcomers wanted. The peace of the forest and river was at stake, and this was a threat they hadn't anticipated. The newcomers moved slowly toward Juma and Kazi, their large frames casting long shadows in the fading light of the forest. They were clearly powerful, but they made no immediate move to attack. Instead, their leader, a particularly tall and imposing creature with dark fur, stepped forward, his eyes locked on Juma. "Who are you?" the leader asked, his voice deep and resonant. Juma, always the diplomat, raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "My name is Juma, and this is Kazi. We come from the heart of the forest. Who are you, and why have you come here?" The leader tilted his head slightly, studying Juma. "We are wanderers," he said after a long pause. "We come from a distant land where the resources have dried up. We seek a new home, and we have heard of the peace and plenty of this forest." Juma exchanged a glance with Kazi. The situation was delicate. On one hand, the newcomers were seeking refuge, but on the other, the forest and river's balance was fragile, and introducing new creatures could upset that harmony. Kazi, always cautious, stepped forward. "This forest has fought hard for peace. We've united the forest and the river, but it's still a delicate balance. If you're looking for a home, you'll have to prove that you can live by our rules." The leader of the newcomers nodded thoughtfully. "We understand. We mean no harm. We only seek a place to settle, where we can live in peace." Juma's mind raced. He knew that offering sanctuary to these newcomers could either strengthen the forest or destabilize it entirely. But as a leader, he had to think of the future, and part of that meant adapting to change. "We will talk with the other animals of the forest and river," Juma said carefully. "If you are willing to live peacefully, then maybe we can find a way to welcome you." The leader of the newcomers nodded in agreement, and with that, Juma and Kazi turned back toward the heart of the forest. The future of the forest now rested on how they would handle this new challenge. When Juma and Kazi returned to the forest and shared news of the newcomers, the reaction was swift and mixed. Some animals were open to the idea, believing that new creatures could strengthen their community, while others were more skeptical, fearing that the newcomers would bring conflict and disrupt the hard-won peace. The wise old tortoise, always calm and reflective, was among the first to speak. "Every creature deserves a home," he said thoughtfully. "If these newcomers seek peace, we should give them a chance." But others were less convinced. A fox, known for her cunning, narrowed her eyes. "We've only just managed to unite the forest and the river. How do we know these newcomers won't bring trouble? It's a risk we can't afford." The animals began to argue, their voices rising in a cacophony of concerns and questions. Juma listened carefully, his mind working to find a solution that would satisfy everyone. Finally, he raised his hands for silence. "I understand your concerns," Juma said, his voice steady. "But we cannot turn our backs on those in need. If the newcomers are willing to live by our rules, peacefully as part of our community, then we should give them a chance. But we will proceed carefully. They must earn our trust, just as we've earned each other's." The animals murmured in agreement, though some were still hesitant. The decision had been made, but the forest was divided once again. Juma knew that this was the most delicate moment they had faced since uniting the forest and the river. The peace they had worked so hard to build was on the line. The newcomers were allowed to enter the forest, but only under careful watch. Juma and Kazi agreed that the new creatures would be tested. They had to prove that they could live peacefully among the other animals. The forest was their home, and it was their responsibility to protect it. The newcomers understood the conditions and agreed. They were assigned a small area near the river, close enough to be monitored, but far enough not to disturb the established territories of the forest and river creatures. In the following days, the animals of the forest and river observed the newcomers closely. They watched as the new creatures hunted for food, built shelters, and interacted with one another. At first, the newcomers kept to themselves, but slowly, they began to reach out to the other animals, offering to share resources and help where needed. The young deer, who had always been open-minded, approached Juma one evening. "They seem kind," the deer said. "They've offered to help us gather food for the winter." Juma nodded, relieved that the newcomers were making an effort. But the real test was yet to come. It wasn't enough for the newcomers to coexist. They had to show that they were willing to live by the rules of the forest. As the days passed, the newcomers' actions spoke louder than words. They worked with the forest animals, shared resources, and respected the boundaries set by Juma and Kazi. Slowly, the animals began to trust them.
But Juma knew that not everyone was convinced. Some animals, like the fox and a few of the larger predators, still eyed the newcomers with suspicion. It would take time for full trust to be earned. As the seasons changed and the forest began to prepare for winter, the newcomers had proven themselves. The peace of the forest had not been disrupted. In fact, it had been strengthened. The newcomers had brought new skills, new ideas, and a willingness to work alongside the animals of the forest and the river. One evening, as Juma and Kazi sat at the riverbank, watching the sun set over the water, they reflected on everything they had been through. From their first confrontation to the peace they had built, to the challenge of integrating the newcomers, they had come a long way. "We've done something good here," Juma said quietly, his eyes on the horizon. "The forest and the river, and now even these newcomers, we've all found a way to live together." Kazi, ever the realist, grunted. "It wasn't easy, and it won't stay easy. There will always be challenges." Juma smiled, understanding Kazi's cautious outlook. "That's true, but we've learned that we can overcome those challenges together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest and river in a warm golden glow, Juma and Kazi sat in companionable silence. The forest had entered a new era, one of unity, peace, and shared purpose. The journey had not been easy, but through cleverness, trust, and cooperation, Juma and Kazi had brought about a lasting peace that would guide the forest and river for generations to come. Thank you so much for watching Bedtime Folktale. I hope you enjoyed this story and feel a little more relaxed and ready for sweet dreams. If you want more enchanting tales, be sure to subscribe, like, and share with your friends. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another magical folktale. See you in the next story.